guys? It is time for a little NBA deeper dive for today's slate, which is just one game. So we will talk about everything you can possibly talk about on this show, as well as the next hour after this one, a live before lock show coming up with Eytan and Greg. So stay tuned on the channel. But I am Chris Spags, joined once again by a man who's with me in the MLB and now is with me once again in the NBA streets. He's our director of customer success at Awesemo and a great guy. He's Terry McBride. How you doing, Terry?
Doing pretty good, pal. Doing pretty good. It's been a good Saturday. Got into baseball a little bit, although I missed, I guess, when FanDuel's tournament filled for the baseball slate. So I only got like 4 lineups in there, but it was a good day. And yeah, just kind of enjoying looking into the basketball slate here, even though we only got one game. Should be interesting to talk about one game for an hour, I guess. We'll see where we go. But yeah, happy to get into it with you. How you doing?
I am good. It's Saturday. We got one more shot here. Yesterday, I will say, a bit of a disenchanting one for me as somebody who honestly was just with the field on Kevin Huerter and then with the field on Danny Green and then under the field on Nikola Jokic. A tough combination, but that's what it's all about, Terry, right? We dust ourselves off. We get back on the horse. It's all you can ever do in the world of DFS and betting.
That's it. And, I think we're going to get, at least with, the majority of our lineups, we're going to see you're getting knocked in the dirt more often than not. But as long as you climb to the top of the mountain every now and then and you follow a good process and get up off the floor, like you said, and dust yourself off and keep on grinding, you'll get there. So that's the way to do it for sure. But yeah, I missed most of last night. I basically checked out after the baseball show that I did. I was just knocked on my ass by that second shot. So I slept through most of everything last night, but I caught up this morning on what actually happened and glad I didn't play.
Yeah, that is sometimes the case. And honestly, if you feel like that playing on DraftKings or FanDuel, one alternative you might want to try for yourself is going to be our sponsor for this show, Prize Picks, who is offering the simplest fantasy game on the market. You can say goodbye to sharks, lineup optimizers, and mass multi-entry. All you have to do is pick 2, 3, 4, or 5 players available on the board to go over or under their projected score. If you correctly select the 5-player lineup, you can get yourself up to 10x your entry fee. And you go to the NFL, to the NBA, to esports, to MLB. Prize Picks has it all. You can combine your picks across all the sports available. So download the mobile app in the App Store or on Google Play today and make your first deposit to get an instant deposit match of up to $100 when you use the promo code Awesemo. Simplify daily fantasy with Prize Picks today. And genuinely, that is something I would recommend. Prize Picks, not only just a very generous deposit bonus on there, but just a simpler game. I know sometimes we are doing these shows. We see people in the chat just tilting over, hey, I was this one guy away in this lineup. And that's going to be every night in DFS for the most part, unless you are getting that variance on your side. On Prize Picks, you can sort of make it your own game with the size of lineups that you're making for yourself. Again, 2, 3, 4, or 5 players available. It's all up to you how much risk you want to take on. So go check them out. Use that promo code Awesemo for the $100 deposit match. And speaking of, we also have a deal going right now at awesemo.com/join, where if you use the promo code NBA Deeper Dive, get yourself 15% off your first week of Awesemo Plus. You get just the NBA package, or you can get yourself an all sport package. That's covering everything going on right now, including the UFC pay-per-view tonight, the NBA, the MLB, PGA is also going on. Euro 2020, even though it's 2021, that's going on right now. And actually, I think Awesemo won one of the Euro 2020 tournaments using the projections that are coming from our guy Giovanni, or at least greatly shaped by our guy Giovanni. So lots of good stuff going on. Go use that promo code NBA Deeper Dive to take advantage of it at awesemo.com/join. Terry, any overall thoughts for you on the slate here? We obviously do have a single game going on, and there may be just something you're seeing for approach or just actually relative to Utah or the Clippers. But I'll give you the blank slate first before we go in and basically go player by player here to get through the entire slate.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a single game slate, so of course we've got to worry about how the ownership's distributed at either the captain spot on DraftKings or between the multiplier spots on FanDuel. We've got basically 4 different guys who slot in as the MVP, and that's it on the FanDuel board. And then that expands out depending on what you're looking at the star and the pro positions. On captain, on DK, you get a little bit more flexibility because you've got the multiplied salary, which makes a difference. One thing that jumped out is the salary on Donovan Mitchell was actually a mistake. The multiplier was off of 11,000, I think, if I'm correct on that. So I think you're getting a tiny bit of a discount on the Donovan Mitchell salary on DK at captain, if that means anything to you, relative to what it's supposed to be with the 1.5 multiplier, unless I did that wrong. I'm looking for where it is on my board. But yeah, I mean, in terms of who we're getting to, I think it's relatively obvious. There are specific names on these teams. We know what we're getting with the Utah side of things now. I haven't seen the Clippers confirmed lineup as far as Zubac goes, but that's kind of a secondary consideration at the flex positions more than it is a captain consideration. So I think we're basically looking at somewhat obvious plays in terms of who we're putting at those MVPs and captain spots.
And that's always going to be the thing where yesterday you saw it. If you were playing that showdown for the Denver slate or the Denver Phoenix game, Nikola Jokic ends up as captain. And this is something too, where if you watch the late slate shows throughout the year, it was a very profitable strategy to mostly fade the top owned captain. And it's something that I'm opening up a little bit more because it's the playoffs, because the concentration is there a lot more for the minutes for these guys that I would have previously advocated. Just, hey, like, either really cut down on captain. I still think that's probably going to move for some of the chalk captains we're going to talk about here. But I think in general, I'm a little more willing to get the chalk captain than I normally would be. I think there are, and we see it on these slates, there's enough ways to get different with the ownership and some of the lower owned plays that are in the mix. I think to me, it's something that I'm going to be a little more open to, though. Today is a day we're going to have Paul George, it looks like, as the chalk captain. So let me actually refresh the ownership and make sure that's the most correct number we have. But maybe a guy who you don't have to get too crazy under overall, but still a guy that I think is going to be maybe a bit overowned, but still going to be worth exposure. And that's the double talk you're going to get on the slate because it's a showdown. That's the way it's got to go. So let's get into the game by game. And if you can't hit the like button, guys, we're going to basically give you everything that's in our brains about this one. Hopefully some of it will help you guys get on the right path. But let's start with Donovan Mitchell, who should benefit once more. Note Mike Conley in this game. Thankfully, we got that news bright and early. And Mitchell on the year has been about a 30% assist rate guy. In addition to his usual 33.4-ish percent assist rate, that doesn't take a big jump. In the playoffs, Terry, we're seeing Mitchell regularly get above 40% usage enough that I'm actually bumping up Mitchell's usage. I'm keeping the assist rate the same, keeping it around that 30% mark. But I'm giving him 38% usage today just because I think even if the Clippers do, they should trap him more. They should basically be doing what the Sixers have done a little more with Trae Young, where they're setting one good defender at him, then setting another guy at him basically every single time. They're not doing that yet with Mitchell for the Clippers, or at least not consistently enough. And I think that's something that could change today. But I think despite that, I don't see a pathway for Mitchell to not get those shots up. So to me, Terry, how are you handling him? And I guess, are you willing to get there? Because if you look at the median projection on Awesemo today, it's not a fantastic one. It's one that's going to put him behind both Kawhi and Paul George. And to me, it was important to get him at least a little bit flatter with those guys, even if he is going to be, I think, a bit behind in terms of that median projection, those other star players.
Yeah, I think we've got him projected behind, and I guess it's probably accounting for that a little bit. But we're talking about a guy who's at 1.40 fantasy points per minute across the playoffs, and we're comparing him to two guys who, I don't want to say completely cannibalize one another because they're both good players and they both play well and produce together. But for the playoffs, Paul George 1.07, Kawhi Leonard 1.30. Now it's a smaller sample for Mitchell because he missed a couple games, but it's not like he's, it's not like those are really close. So yeah, in the median projection, we've got him underneath those guys. But I think there's a good possibility for the range of outcomes conversation that he's the one who's going to have the opportunity to go off. There's not really, Rudy Gobert, low usage guy, Ingles and Clarkson, kind of secondary guys. Like, he's the primary star, the primary scorer here for his team, where it could go to either Paul George or Kawhi on the Clippers side of things. They could share that a little bit more. So I think if we're looking for like an apex scoring kind of a play, it's got to be Mitchell. That said, you're definitely paying up for him on both sites, and you're eating a lot of ownership in terms of he's 14.9 in the captain spot. So actually, out of the three, he's the lowest owned. So I think that's compelling as well in the captain spot on DK. And then in the MVP spot on FanDuel, you're getting a major discount in ownership from the two Clippers guys down to either him, or if you wanted to even extend that out to Rudy Gobert. Gobert, out of the four guys that I mentioned at MVP, getting the smallest share by far. So I think he's compelling in terms of putting him in one of those big multiplier spots if all the ownership is going to the Clippers guys.
Yeah, and I think that's where I'm with it too, where I'm actually going to be with the field on a Donovan Mitchell captain ownership on DraftKings, it looks like, but I'm going to be above it on the utility ownership. And I'm actually surprised to see the number. And I think it might be what you're talking about, Terry, with some of the price tags for him, but he's projected for only 49% ownership at utility on DraftKings. That to me seems low. And in the captain spot, 15%, I think that's about reasonable. But and it's entirely possible here that people may be a little bit less logical with Mitchell. And I think the ownership projection is something we've talked about throughout the playoffs. Like, there is some assumption here. It's a logical, approach to say the slate rather than people just kind of jamming guys in, cramming in the Rondos of the world, like stuff like that happens sometimes in the slates that I think could maybe make it different. But to me, Mitchell, a viable captain play, not going to be my highest owned captain. I think some of the cheaper captains we're going to talk about are going to be more appealing to me, but one that should be in the mix there. And I think for utility, our guy Antoine Murphy in the chat talking about maybe playing some lineups without Mitchell. And I'm never going to be opposed to playing some lineups without Mitchell. I am playing him only in 80% of my lineups today. But I do think, and I don't know if you feel differently with this, Terry, as well, that Mitchell to me should be in the vast majority of lineups. That if you're not putting him in, like I'm not putting him in 20% of my lineups, I'm putting in 60 today. And I just wanted to get some different look for that number of lineups. But I think, if you're putting in a bunch, to me, he should still be in maybe 80 to 90 or 75 to 90, depending on your comfort levels.
Yeah, I think so for sure. And just looking at it, it looks like the field's going to be pretty well under that in terms of the overall ownership across both captain and flex. Our ownership projection is under 65% for him, which if you're not rostering Donovan Mitchell for one game slate, I don't really know what we're talking about. I think the salary is challenging to get him, Kawhi, Paul George, like all the stars that you want, but there are good ways to put these lineups together where you're getting two of those guys and then getting two interesting pieces that work well in terms of projecting toward solid upside. So I think it's a mistake to leave that much Mitchell on the table. I would be looking to get over the field on that. And I think that's more interesting than trying to force the issue and get over the field on one or the other of the Clippers, who are both going to be higher owned. By those guys, I mean Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, of course.
Yeah, and I think to me, the ideal construction is going to be getting to all three guys. I know that makes it tough, but that to me is the thing, is you're trying to find the lower own margins with that for the most part, at least how I'm approaching it. I think we see that time and time again. And, on the Clipper side, we're going to talk through Utah a little bit more, but the Clipper side, like they can't go down 3-0. I mentioned this in yesterday's game with Denver, and you really saw with the Jokic effort where they were throwing everything they could out there. Jokic played a ton more minutes, or a ton of minutes overall, and was obviously very productive in it, but like that was a desperation spot. And that's a Denver team who's also come back twice last year from 3-1 deficits. Like teams do not want to be down 3-0. So to me, I think the logic in not playing Mitchell is that, hey, maybe there is a pathway for the Clippers to win this one in a blowout. I don't know how likely that is, but that is certainly one pathway. Or just, Mitchell is getting double teamed over and over again. And you see Ingles and Bojan and Jordan Clarkson and I guess Gobert to some extent do whatever they can to prop it up. And maybe they just don't quite get there. Those to me are the pathways that Mitchell doesn't get into the winning lineup. But based on what we've seen, I'm not impressed with the Clippers defense and how they're handling really any lead scorers. Yeah. Same thing last year's Luka too, where the only thing that held him down was just having that neck issue. So in the spot, to me, I think Mitchell's a better play, and I would certainly want to have him a lot more than not. And I guess one question, Terry, says, I know you are generally more of a FanDuel guy. Mitchell, 50% owned on FanDuel today is the projection, 15% at MVP as well. So low numbers for him, and it's not a great price tag there. He's the most expensive guy on the slate at $15K, but how would you handle him on FanDuel? And I guess, is he worth paying up to be contrarian? Because I would think he is.
Yeah, to me, he really is. You're paying a little bit. You're paying what, 500 more, so that's like 1 unit more the way that FanDuel prices these things for him from Kawhi. So it's not like it's a huge difference anyway. It doesn't make that dramatic a difference in what you're able to get to having him there or him in your lineup at any position, because there's not a multiplier on it. And when you're getting that dramatic ownership discount, I think it makes a ton of sense especially when he's projecting similarly. He's been the highest scoring guy in the series. He's the highest point per minute guy who's going to have a viable minutes projection for the course of the playoffs. I think it makes all the sense in the world to put him there.
Yeah, so I think he's an interesting play, and if he's going to be that low owned on FanDuel, I think that's certainly one thing you can do to get different right away, and you're certainly giving yourself some upside, even if you are making the rest of the lineup a little bit tougher to build. Let's keep going to the Jazz. Rudy Gobert is one guy for me. He's going to be 50% owned overall, it looks like, on DraftKings today, and I'm going to be well low of that number, and it gives me some concern because Gobert has been solid. He's playing the Jazz are basically playing a big man every minute of the floor that's out there, so you're going to see one of Gobert favors basically every minute. That was what it was last game, and the assumption would be it's going to continue to hold form. But this spot, I feel like Gobert is at a price tag that I'd rather find more money and get to Paul George and get to Kawhi, who are, again, playing in desperation spots. These guys are going to play probably unlimited minutes tonight because they just have to not lose this game. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And Mitchell, I just like more. And I guess if you are less bullish than Terry and I am on Mitchell, maybe you go to Gobert instead, or you go down even a little more to Clarkson. But I don't see 50% of Rudy Gobert being the best move on the slate, Terry. And I don't know if you feel differently, because I just think the big three is the move, is you have to get these guys in on DK's Showdown. So how are you feeling about Rudy Gobert?
Yeah, on DK, I think that it makes more sense. On FanDuel, 13.5, you're getting a little bit of a discount for him, and you're getting an ownership discount across all the multiplier positions. And when we talk about him, he's at 1.26 fantasy points per minute for the playoffs. He's the only other guy on this slate in this game who's likely might not be the wrong word, but he's got the probability to give you that like 50 fantasy point game. So I think he makes some sense to at least consider in some ownership shares there. And I think he's at 45% on the FanDuel slate. There are ways to work that in where you're getting him plus two of the other stars and putting together somewhat reasonable lineups. So it depends on the quality of construction that you can get to. Just looking at it in a crunch that I just ran, Across 500 lineups, the only 3 guys who came up in the MVP position on FanDuel, just using the optimal, not using any randomness or anything like I've been doing for these shows, were Kawhi, Paul George, and Donovan Mitchell. Based on how much we've got Kawhi and Paul George projected ahead of Mitchell, those 2 guys are outstripping it by far, and it makes sense that that's how it's coming up with our projections on FanDuel. But based on the ownership numbers, again, with Mitchell and with Gobert, I think that it makes some sense to look to be contrarian and put those guys into the multiplier spots. But to your point on the DK slate, I think it makes a lot of sense to focus on just getting those guys in where you're just playing flex players, except for the captain. It makes sense to kind of go with the extended minutes that we're expecting from the Clippers guys and kind of just lock in the playing time and the points, the raw points, and then the upside points there. So that does make a lot of sense. As far as, I think we don't want to exaggerate too much about the must-win situation narrative. Like, yes, the Clippers absolutely have to win this game. They're going to run these guys into the ground in order to do it. But by the same token, Utah, they held serve at home, and now they're coming into LA. They want to win this game. They need to steal 1 of 1 in LA to bring it back and have a lead. So it makes sense that this is also maybe not a must-win game for them. Like, if they are going to drop a game, it would be this one. But they're not coming into this looking at it as this is a punt spot by any means. So we're going to see 38 to 40 minutes out of Mitchell. We're going to see 33 to 36 minutes out of Gobert. We're going to see these guys play extended run. So it's not like it's that dramatic. And, once we start injecting things like these guys want to win more, these guys need to win more, we're getting away from the things we really need to care about, like the minutes and the rates. So I do like to temper that discussion a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I guess to me, I do feel like your point's pretty sound too about like Utah's clearly going to, like, they know, just like the Clippers know, if you go up 3-0, that's the end of the series, basically. Like, you'll still have that, that death knell, that death rattle in game 4 for the most part. Maybe you even win that one, as we have seen some teams do this season, or this playoff season. But I would say for me that, for a guy like Gobert who's already splitting minutes, like, this isn't the spot to me that he gets to 40 minutes, I don't think. Whereas Mitchell, like, I think is probably going to be in that range. We've projected for 38.5 minutes right now from our Awesemo data team, and I think there's a pathway for him to get to 40, especially if he's running hot at a period and they're just trying to keep the Clippers at bay. Maybe the Jazz have some sort of lead, though. The Jazz, is worth pointing out, are a 5-point dog on the road here, which is pretty big spread going against Utah. So something to keep in mind for that. But I think Gobert is one of those pieces where it wouldn't shock me, and I think this is one of the narratives I'm hoping for based on how my exposures worked out, is that Gobert gets on just a touch of foul trouble, and that leads to some success for Zubac and maybe a few more minutes for one of the better value plays on the slate in Derek Favors, the guy who's playing all the minutes Gobert doesn't play. But I think to me, there's just a lot of reason to not go to the middle class on DraftKings. And that also includes Jordan Clarkson. Jordan Clarkson, to me, another guy that I'll be in just under 10% ownership. And I don't love that. Clarkson certainly has a tournament upside, but he's projected for 31% ownership. And I feel like the projections to me are going to shade more towards Mitchell. Mitchell's playing more minutes means that Clarkson has less effective minutes of him getting full unencumbered run. It's kind of the same thing for Joe Ingles too, to a similar extent, where Mitchell's kind of got to kill those guys. And I think that's something that for Clarkson is really meaningful to me. So I'll be under on him, and I guess Bojan too. And I don't know, Terry, if you feel anything as strongly as I do here. I just think playing a lot of these mid-tier guys, just not the approach I want to go to. I'm going to really load up on the stars and just try to get one of those outlier performances from somebody who's cheap or less owned. But how are you feeling about Bojan, about Jordan Clarkson, I guess in particular? We could put Joe Ingles separately because he's a little bit of a different price tag, but are you willing to go to these guys? Do you find them to be appealing tournament options, or are you with me that just get the stars and don't worry about the rest?
Yeah, I think primarily I'm with you. I want to get to a good amount of the stars, and particularly you look at a guy like Bojan on the DK slate, pulling 33% ownership on at the flex spot, pulling a handful of shares at the captain spot. It's not like he's going to be sneaky. It's not like he's going to be under owned. We've got him projected for almost 37 minutes. The coach was talking about how he locked out Kawhi in the fourth quarter of the last game. There's reason to believe he's going to be out there for his full run, hit his marks in terms of our median projection, and not necessarily do all that much more. So if you just want to lock in that number, if you need some roster filler and you've got the salary to spend on them, then sure, you can do that. But is it, something that's going to set you far apart from the field at that ownership? I don't really think so. And it's not like he's crazy cheap. 6,800 at the flex spot. It's not like he's one of these, like you're saying, $2,400 guys, $4,200 guys, or crazy low priced, Rajon Rondos of the world, or Patrick Beverleys of the world. So yeah, I think it makes sense to kind of look to get as many of the stars in as you can, and then look to any of the really cheap guys who are going to get any reasonable expectation of any kind of minutes. And if you have the luxury of picking between the guys who produce more fantasy points per minute, so much the better. I don't know that we're going to have that luxury today with some of the options on the board, but we do at least have the cheap filler guys that we can kind of plug in. If you can create, like, there's always the idea of telling the story of the game when we're building for single game ownership. So if you come into an idea of, all right, I'm going to build these 10 lineups with the idea that, player X gets into foul trouble, that's when I'll start maybe looking to some of these mid-range guys, because those guys are going to have to step up and fill that role, fill that gap, maybe pick up some additional minutes, maybe see an uptick in usage. And that's where maybe like a Jordan Clarkson sees a few extra minutes. If something goes wonky with, Donovan Mitchell is, not playing well, getting shut down, something like that, they want to change things up. Or just maybe Utah gets out well ahead and Donovan Mitchell doesn't play that much. Jordan Clarkson sees a little bit more time. You're looking for these kind of stories to tell, and that's when I would get to the mid-range. But for me, yeah, these guys aren't priced or owned appropriate to where I'd really be looking to get to tons of them.
Yeah, and I think that to me is really the cause for concern, where if they were being overlooked entirely, if they were, even 20% or less owned, I would be there more. But if we're going to have projections of over 30% for really all these guys, actually for all these guys we're talking about, and I think especially, on the other side too, Reggie Jackson's a guy that I find more appealing, who's going to be, it looks like projected for only 18% ownership on DK. I'd rather take that stab, given Reggie Jackson seemingly earning his way to more minutes based on the fact he's been probably I wouldn't say the Clippers' best player throughout the playoffs, but at least there with the top 3 guys or top 2 guys. Yeah. I think it's something to keep in mind, that I just don't like the Jazz middle class that much. And to me, this is something I think, Terry, on Fantasy Cruncher, they don't allow you to do it anymore, but you used to be able to have a guy as a key player, and if he's not in a lineup, you give the other guys a 10% boost. That to me is something where I think that's the one pathway where you can get more Clarkson, more Bojan. I think in particular, those 2 guys, is if you had Mitchell not in a lineup and you give those guys a boost in your lineups without Mitchell, or if you just took Mitchell out of some crunch and then just ran one where you gave Bojan and Clarkson a boost. I think that's the spot, because to me, that's the only way they get there, is if Mitchell is outright bad, then you see Clarkson and Bojan get there. But I think if Mitchell's doing what he's been doing, I just don't see the potential for these guys at their price tags.
Yeah, Mitchell just swallowing up so much usage and playing so effectively and so well and scoring the ball so much that, there's just not that much on the table for them. So, yeah, that's the way to build it, is to give them a little bit of a bump, or maybe just manually get in there and start inserting them into lineups where you're not getting Mitchell, because that is, like I was saying, telling the story of that specific angle of the game. All right, Mitchell's not playing well. What's the next most logical spot? They're going to have to find scoring somewhere. All right, that leads us to Jordan Clarkson. It leads us to potentially Bojan. So, yeah, makes a lot of sense. But I think the Reggie Jackson call is pretty sharp there, actually, because he's coming in like half the ownership of some of those guys on DK from the mid-range from Utah. I think that makes a ton of sense to start looking at that. He was their leading scorer last game. We've got him projected for plenty of minutes, plenty of upside. So really, I like that call a lot.
And I think that to me is the logic there. You're getting less ownership. You're getting a guy who's, I think, more important overall to what the team is doing or what the team is going to have to do today. And a guy too, who's just kind of earned his way to the minutes throughout the series, where it's not like Bojan and Jordan Clarkson, or I guess especially Bojan, are not at risk of losing minutes by any stretch, but especially no Conley in the mix. But I just feel like Reggie Jackson, to me, like he's the guy that they've clearly cast a lot with. They're going with him and Beverly. And I think it's something we're going to talk about more as we go. But that to me is just the way that I prefer to play it. That said, I do think being worth or close to the field on Joe Ingles is a move that I would like to do, because he's cheap enough to me that you can still get to the core guys without completely killing or depreciating your lineup. And that's the difference between those guys, that if you go to Clarkson and Bojan, I think on DraftKings, you are kind of decreasing the quality of your lineup if you are trying to get the star players in. Ingles, you can get to those star players and him, and I think it's not the worst thing in the world. So that's where I went. And I would also favor Ingles over going to Royce O'Neal by a pretty good margin as well, Terry. So I don't know if you have any feel for those guys, but I would put Ingles and Royce O'Neal in their own tier. And I think you can get to both. Actually, it looks like I'll be with the field on both guys. But I think they are plays to me that I'm just more comfortable with because of the price tags than, again, compared to Clarkson and Bojan. I don't mean to beat up on Clarkson and Bojan today, but I think just as a sip on the slate, you kind of have to.
Yeah. So just in looking at one thing that I think should maybe play in there, Joe Ingles for the playoffs so far, 0.61 fantasy points per minute. Royce O'Neal, 0.74. And we've got Royce O'Neal projected for about, 4 more minutes. So just on that basis alone, we can have some reasonable expectation of a better game from O'Neal at a little bit less ownership, it looks like. Slightly less. Yeah, about coming in a little bit less across the board on the DK slate, and for a little bit less money. So I think there's some basis for making that pivot. I do like Joe Ingles. He's a player I get to a lot, particularly when Conley's out. We see a little bit of a boost in his assists. We've got him projected for over 31 minutes, so there's certainly reason that he's going to be on the board as well. I don't hate the idea of getting to either one of those players. I think just based on the rates and the minutes projections and the idea that he's going to be a little bit less owned and a little bit less expensive, it might lead me to Royce O'Neal. I'm not that excited about that decision, though. Like, if I was doing it without looking at any of this stuff, I would click on Joe Ingles, I think probably 100 out of 100 times, just blindly hand building this. But looking at the board, it's kind of justifiable to go the other way.
Yeah, I think that's, I get it. And I think, so the thing with me with Ingles is that you have to keep in mind, I guess, when judging the fantasy points per minute, is that a lot of these games this year, even though the season has not had Conley, like the playoffs so far have had more Conley than not. And I think that's something for Ingles that is going to be the big driver down of his value. In addition to the fact that Ingles is kind of shot like crap in some of these games. And I was heavy on him last time out, so I certainly can be a bit buoyed by the fact that he was one of my core plays and ended up being one of the guys we had to have in a winning lineup last time out. So that was something that was really helpful to have. But, he's not quite priced cheaply as he was in that last 2 games slate. So I get not being, crazy bullish about Ingles. And I think to me, that's why I'm with the field on both Ingles and O'Neal. I think Ingles is the better play out of the two. So if you had to choose between one, that's certainly the way I would go. And I think Ingles too has the higher ceiling, but I think both guys here, it's not really about these guys individually as it is getting to that price tag and hoping you can get, I think 22 to 30 fantasy points from that spot, maybe more potentially if Ingles really gets hot or Royce O'Neal somehow does better than he ever does. But I think to me, that's the thing, is it's the price tag that works. And it's those guys just giving you 20 to 30. That's really the most important part.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And I was trying to get to it as you were talking there. And that's a good point with Ingles for the playoffs with Conley off. He does jump to 0.75 DraftKings points per minute, 0.72 FanDuel points per minute. My number I gave before was in FanDuel points, but it was definitely lower than that. That's across 86 minutes. And then you get O'Neal 0.75 FanDuel points per minute, 0.72. So those are reversed DK points per minute in a larger 106 minute sample, all with Conley off. So they're about the same guy in terms of the production, depending on which site you're looking at, just scoring points in different ways between the two of them. So that is a very good point that, Ingles does benefit with Conley off, and that needs to be taken into account as far as those fantasy points per minute.
And then the cheap guys for the Jazz, Derek Favors to me. I know we're going to have a lot of talk in the chat, and we have had throughout this show. I actually was watching the strategy show as well with Eytan and Adam from earlier this morning, and people were talking about Patrick Beverley and DeMarcus Cousins a lot in that spot. And Derek Favors, that's why I have interest in Derek Favors. I think, because I'm being light on Rudy Gobert, I think it makes sense for me to have over 20% of Derek Favors because if Rudy Gobert somehow fails, a good pathway for him to fail, or not even fails, but doesn't score enough to get into the winning lineup. One pathway to that happening is for him to get into foul trouble, and Derek Favors to get a few more minutes. So that's part of it for me. But also Favors just a 1 fantasy point per minute guy in the year, 1.04 actually. Today I have him at 1.01. If he does play the 13.4 minutes that we have for him right now, that gives me a 13.5 fantasy point projection on DK. And I think that's enough to get there. And based on the median outcomes with Beverly and DeMarcus Cousins, I think I prefer Favors over them. And that's going to be also accounting for some of the risk here that the ownership could soar for those guys. But Terry, are you with me on this one? Because this is one I will completely allow you to not be with me, but taking Favors over Cousins and Beverly on the Clippers side, is that something you would consider, or would you be maybe more inclined to spread that ownership around and get even amounts of all those guys?
No, I think that probably makes the most sense out of all those guys on the board. If I was going to argue it would be with Beverly, but I think the ownership is probably such that it's at worst even. And I think there's just, Favors plays a position where just more things can fall into his hands, right? So you got that range of outcomes where just a couple missed shots and all of a sudden he's got a few extra rebounds that we weren't counting on. Like, there's more happenstance in his numbers. So you're playing a broader game. You might end up with a more limited guy, of course, with that. But I think there's just that random scoring where with Patrick Beverly, like, we kind of know where his points are coming from. And if he doesn't get there, he doesn't get there. Favors has some things that are out of his control that could contribute to his scoring. And the pricing is such that it makes sense getting to, maybe pay up a little bit more. And it looks like they are pulling about even in terms of the ownership. So the ownership's about the same. But yeah, if we're talking about which one of these guys to look to, I think there's a good argument for it to be Favors. Just seems a little bit more reliable, a little bit safer in terms of the minutes upside. Like you've said a couple times, him and Gobert, basically one's going to be on the court at all times. So if you get that game, again, telling the story of the game, if you get that game where Gobert picks up a couple early fouls, maybe we see Favors run out to a few extra minutes, to a lot of extra minutes potentially. depending on how that game goes. So if we're building a bunch of lineups for a showdown slate, that's got to be in your range of outcomes. Your at least a few shares of that, taking that possibility into account. So I think Favors makes a lot of sense.
And that's really where I'm also coming down with it, where, last game Favors played 12 minutes and also scored a negative 0.5 fantasy points. Like, that's not the player he's been all year long. And I think it wasn't even the player he was in game one, where he had 17 fantasy points. If he somehow got you to 17 fantasy points today, you are probably winning a tournament. I think if Favors ends up at where he's projected right now, looks like we have him at 22% ownership. I think that honestly might be a little more aggressive given how box score watchy people are, and the fact that, again, just taking the pulse of people, what people were talking about. They're both in our YouTube chat today and social media. A lot of people talk about Beverly. A lot of people talk about Cousins. Cousins didn't play minutes in the second half last game when they basically locked it down to a 7-man rotation with just like one other guy rotating in for a few minutes in both man and Luke Kennard. I think in this spot, to me, I just feel like Favors minutes can be there and should be there. And hopefully he just runs hot with them. And that's the hope. And this is one, Terry, again, you very much should have to back me on this one, but I also find Georges Niang and Mie Oni worth exposure because they are players who will be unowned. Both guys under 10% ownership, both guys cheap. And that to me is the thing, just getting one low owned guy, hoping he can somehow spike an upside. And Mie Oni in particular, I'm really squinting my eyes there, but it's 5% ownership for me. I don't care that he's a 0.55 fantasy point per minute guy. Somehow he hits a couple threes. That could be enough.
0.25 fantasy points per minute for the playoffs.
That's good. So he's really shown some progress here.
Yeah, look, we're beginning to stretch credulity a little bit there, but you're only paying 1,000 for him. So you're paying a fraction of what you're paying for any of these other guys. So he could trip over the sideline and still hit value here. So it's not completely off the table. It's not completely out of the range of possibilities. If I'm building one lineup, is he in it? No. If I'm building 150 lineups, is he in any of them? Maybe. I'll check what it came up in the crunch. Let's find out together. Let's see. He did not come up in the crunch across 500 lineups, unfortunately. So I don't know how optimal he's going to be, but it's in the range of outcomes. He's projected to have minutes, so anything can happen. Let's put it that way. And if we get one of those games where, let's say it's that crazy game where Donovan Mitchell wasn't playing well, Jordan Clarkson was picking up more minutes, but now Jordan Clarkson maybe gets hurt, or he's got to run to the bathroom for a few minutes, and Mie Oni picks up a few extra minutes. If he's playing 12 minutes instead of 7, could he have a relevant score for 1,000? Sure. So based on that kind of a narrative, based on that kind of a story to tell about the game, yeah, he could be in play for that price. I think Georges Niang, we've got him projected for over 12 minutes. There's a little bit more meat on the bone there. So if I was picking between those guys, I'd rather double his salary and go to Georges Niang. I'm not sure how much I would get to either one of them, though.
Yeah, and to be clear, fractional amounts of them for both. I actually will have, you know what? I have even less Mie Oni than I thought. The field's going to be at 6.6%. I have 1.7%. So I have him in literally one of my 60 lineups tonight. And Yang, I have in 10% of my lineups compared to the field, 7%. So I am with you, I guess, technically, that I am above the field on Georges Niang. But just again, Mie Oni, the reason I got him in is because he's in one lineup. And that's, if you got to 6.6% of the field, I certainly wouldn't hate it just because there's no other 1K player on the slate. He doesn't
have to do a lot, and he doesn't have to do it many times. If you make that play 100 times, he probably only has to deliver for you once for that to pay off nicely. So that makes sense. And just taking a look at that crunch across 500 lineups, again, no randomness or anything like that. We did get to 10%, 50 lineups out of 500 with Georges Niang in it. So I think he's a little bit more on the board and somebody you can maybe look to and maybe squeeze over the field on.
And then just real fast, we might, if we have some time, we're going to talk more about player props at the end, but some of the Utah player props that look the best on the board, according to Awesemo's player prop tool, which is free on the site. You can check it out. And basically just will find you the best odds and tell you where to get it through our odds shopper site at oddsshopper.com. But some of the props here, Royce O'Neal over 1.5 assists is a 77% win rate. So that looks like one of the better ones on the board. Obviously going to benefit a little bit from not having Mike Conley in the mix. Rudy Gobert under 14.5 rebounds is a 74% win rate. So that's an interesting one to note given my anti-Rudy Gobert narrative. I'm projected for 13.8 rebounds today, though. Obviously, with standard deviation, that one could come close, but 74% win rate looks good. And Donovan Mitchell under 31.5 points is actually a 73% win rate. And I'm a little surprised by this, Terry, but given even that boost that I gave to Mitchell, I gave him that 38% usage rate on the day, and I still only have him at 29.4 real life points today. So kind of a surprising one, I guess, Terry. I don't know if you feel differently about Mitchell, but like we like Mitchell as a play, and 31.5 seems like an easy number to hit, but 73% chance of winning on the under is kind of crazy.
Yeah, that's a little surprising. I don't have a projection on it myself, but look, he's averaging 41 points, I think, for this series. So I think it's certainly there for him to hit that 31 mark. That's not that high. unless they know something I don't, or they're thinking he doesn't see the minutes that we've got him projected for. If he sees the 38.5 minutes that we've got him projected for, I could see him going through that with relative ease. So I'd be surprised. I'm surprised by that.
Yeah. I feel like the Royce O'Neal one, to me, if you're taking a prop from the Utah side, that's the one that I would take over 1.5 assists. He's going to get the court time. He could definitely stumble into an assist or two because it's what Royce O'Neal does. I'm projected for 3 assists today. Let's talk about the Clippers side. And guys, hit that like button if you can. As I mentioned earlier in the show, we do have Live Before Lock coming on after us. You'll have Eytan and Greg obviously talking a little more in terms of questions and a general game strategy. Here we're trying to give you guys an outlook based on Awesemo's data and our own views on everything based on basically every player on the slate. So hang out for that show, of course, and hit that like button if you can. We appreciate it a bunch, especially here on a Saturday. It's such a sunny Saturday out there. I'm just watching all the other kids play outside like on Bart Simpson's episode where he broke his leg. So help us out. Hit the like button to make me feel better. Terry, I feel like you're a Simpsons guy, aren't you?
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Half my vocabulary is Simpsons quotes from seasons 1 through 8. So that's, right up my alley for sure. Although we had a kind of a nasty rainy day here, not rainy, but just kind of like that overcast, and at least it's still 4:00 in the afternoon for you. So you can go out and do some fun things still after this.
Yeah. We maybe a dinner coming. We'll see how the girlfriend's feeling. She's also doing work for her job. So fun times in the Spags household, everybody doing work and dogs laying around looking sad. So that's the best combination. Let's talk about the Clippers here. The 2 stars are going to be the most important parts. Paul George predicted for 88.5% overall ownership on DraftKings, 93% overall ownership on FanDuel, and those guys on the Live Before Lock show will talk more about ownership. No money time on the deeper dive. Serious business only on the deeper dive. But Paul George, a lot of ownership going his way. Kawhi, less ownership on both sites, which kind of surprises me. I will be heavier on Kawhi today, though. Both guys to me going to be around in the neighborhood of 90% plays. Kawhi to me the more appealing captain option on DraftKings, given that Paul George currently projects as the chalk captain option. But talk to me about these guys, Terry. And I guess if you had to choose between one, I don't think you have to. Honestly, I think you can easily get to both guys if that's the way you're building. But if you had to choose between one, who would you choose?
I would probably play the ownership game there and go with the guy projected for less ownership, who's more expensive, but is scoring more fantasy points per minute for us, and go with Kawhi in that situation if I'm choosing between these two guys. But these two guys are going to be in the majority of DraftKings lineups that you build. I think they just basically have to be. They're coming up in, across 500 lineups. We got to, like I said before, it was coming up mostly with Kawhi and Paul George up at the top. 41% came up Paul George captain, and then 21% Kawhi. So again, that's just running with the pure projections coming out with no randomness or anything. Based on that, again, I think it would be a little bit maybe anti-optimizer to just go the other way and start building Kawhi and pay a little bit more and put him into those captain shares and gain a little bit of ground on the field. He's coming up 16% owned in the captain spot. I think we can get away with stretching that out, and you're picking one of the best players, one of the biggest, brightest stars in this game to do it with. So never really disliked doing something like that. But yeah, for the overall aggregate ownership, 80 some odd percent Paul George. And, I would look to actually break through the Fields ownership. I think what we've got projected on Kawhi, I think that's probably pretty low. So I think I would just look for ways to pay to get to Kawhi in this slate, I think.
Yeah, so I'm functionally going to be with the field on Paul George, but I will, by getting to the same ownership for Kawhi that I'm going to have for Paul George, I'll be significantly above the field on Kawhi. And that's just my hope here. I think Paul George has been a more adept rebounder so far in the playoffs overall, just kind of been more aggressive getting peripherals than he was in the regular season. But I just have no reason to believe that that's necessarily going to be the case forever. And I'm honestly surprised to see that Awesemo straight away does have Paul George as a higher projected player. It's not a huge margin here, 51.9 fantasy points, DK fantasy points compared to 50.1 for Kawhi. But I have it the other way for my own projections. So that's the way I'm going to play it. I still have a very healthy amount of Kawhi. As I mentioned, I'll just be with Paul George. I'll be with the field on him. But Kawhi to me is you can get above the field on him and still feel comfortable with it. And I think that to me is the main thing here, where if you to get above the field on Paul George, I think, maybe people out there feel differently. And Terry, I'll ask you, would you want 100% Paul George? Because that's the only way you're actually making a difference here is you take 100% of him, or if you just play him 100% utility and don't play him at all captain.
Yeah. And I mean, look, we're talking about one of the best 4 players on the court in this game at all available. So it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to have it, but with the field at 88%, we're still not gaining that much ground on the field. If he goes off completely, you're still competing with most of the people who have entered this contest. So it's not like you're really gaining much by locking him. So I would look to go the other way probably and come in under the field, not by a lot, but maybe slightly, and put more of that into the Kawhi side of things where I can actually gain ground. I've got 30% or so to work with overall, and plenty of room at the captain spot, plenty of room at the flex spot. So I think it just makes more sense to look to Kawhi. And that's where I like to make this kind of a pivot. Like I said, we're pivoting to a guy who is a superstar. It's not like we're saying like, yeah, all right, take that off and go to Reggie Jackson and load up on him. We're talking about Kawhi Leonard. So I'm fine with doing that. And if the field doesn't want it, then that's an exploitable spot to me, where the field is going to be. It's not like it's low owned, but it's probably lower than it should be comparative to Paul George.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's a good way to view it as well. And yeah, I think that's also a good tournament approach generally. If you could flip ownerships around and get more of a guy who's basically in a similar spot, whether it be, for a large slate of guys at the same price tag and has a projection that's a little bit lower, or a guy on the same team would directly pull away. That is the best way you can get leverage overall on a DFS slate. And I think that's a good approach. If you I'm not going under on Paul George by that much. I'm going under on him at captain, but I think if you were to go under on Paul George and then over for Kawhi, that definitely tells more of a logical narrative, I would say. Marcus Morris, the next player up, we need to talk about here. And what we are going to talk about everybody, as I mentioned earlier in the show. So if you haven't heard some of the guys you find important yet, talked about enough. I think we've sort of intimated about everybody so far, but we will talk through the rest of them over the course of this next 17 minutes. So have no fear. Marcus Morris, I think, is a player who I'm always willing to be above on these playoff slates. He has been a godsend to me a lot of nights here where I've had him a lot more than the field than he will. There are some nights it's not going to be great, but because he is a guy that's just going to get, 35-ish minutes for the most part, up to 40 minutes in some of these playoff games, and he does enough of everything here, I find it hard to believe that he's killing people on most nights. He's always at a price tag too lately. It's going to be usable. That's the same thing on this slate where on DK is 4,800 or excuse me. Yeah. 4,800, right? So that's a price tag to me that makes it hard to avoid him in pretty much all my lineups. And I'm getting a lot more Marcus Morris in the field. I'll be there. Again, it's a lot more than the field. They are projected for 42% ownership. I'll be just shy of 70, it looks like. So I'm with it. And I feel like Morris too viable as captain. He's one guy who does have captain upside, and you can cram in then the other star players fitting the narrative I'm just kind of pushing for how I'm approaching the showdown. But how are you feeling about Marcus Morris? Because I do think, people may be more risk averse than I am. And he's come through enough for me that I definitely have some rose colored glasses for him, but just a player that is solid, but not spectacular. So how are you feeling about him?
He's probably the most viable low-cost captain on the board, right? I'd rather have Marcus Morris, I think, than Royce O'Neal here at captain, and he's lower cost. So I think from that perspective, it makes some sense to consider if you're considering him at captain and trying to get to a 3-star, 4-star lineup in the other spots. I think that makes some sense. He's probably your only real relatively safe bet there. Reggie Jackson costs significantly more and could come in and produce less for you. So I think that's a good play in terms of a pay down captain. And then I would probably be above the fields. 41. Yeah, I might end up with the fields on the overall ownership and the flex ownership, just because it's a spot where maybe I can spread some of that around, or maybe get creative in how I'm spending the money by playing some of these super cheap guys in some of those flex spots, and that gets us to some of these other the other stars instead of Morris in that flex role. So I'm not sure how that would necessarily shake out there, but I would probably be, if I was building 150 lineups anyway, I would probably be over the projected ownership. It's not like you have to do a lot to get over the projected ownership for him at captain. And it's something that's certainly not for the risk averse. It's something you're definitely going out on a limb to do it, but you're not going to be out there with many people, and it doesn't have to connect that many times for it to pay off for you. So I think that's a viable play. And then if you're looking at the FanDuel slate, I think he's somewhat interesting in the not in the MVP spot, certainly, but he's not drawing any ownership really in either the star or the pro spot. Probably more viable in the pro, and under 10% still. So I think he's kind of an interesting mix in over there. But you're paying the same for him over there as you're paying for Reggie Jackson, so you're not getting that salary discount that you are on DK. So I think he's more interesting on the DK slate, where you get a pretty major discount on a guy who we're expecting to play full run and be a productive guy out there.
Yeah. So we are on the same page roughly then. And I will be more bullish here. I'll have him a lot more captain because I think he's an interesting captain that does give you, normally for me, I'm trying to get to 30 to 40 fantasy points for a captain to feel comfortable. And I think that's normally where people go wrong, is that it's not always crappy captains that end up working out, or, a lot of times, obviously it is still the star player, the Nikola Jokic, like we saw yesterday, but it's guys who generally have that upside. It's a Boban who's, in the same Clipper series where we saw some of the Showdown wins that went on with Boban a captain, or at least having having him a functional part of lineups and be in the hunt at captain, it's got to be a guy who's cheap or cheaper relative to these guys and has a good enough upside where he's not completely kill your lineup and keep you viable in case, Kawhi puts up 50. Like Kawhi putting up 50 at a 1.5x is going to be dangerous. But if you somehow have, Kawhi, Paul George, and Donovan Mitchell all around 50, and then, a guy like Marcus Morris gets you to 35, and you could somehow get to those 3 stars, like that's the most important way I think that a guy like that works. So Morris to me is that play at captain today. And I want to talk about Reggie Jackson, but I have to say Ivica Zubac is another guy I'm buying in on today. I would have some issue, I guess, playing him on FanDuel because of the risk, and I think there's a lot of ways you can avoid him. On DraftKings, though, I think he's live as a captain. I think he is very live as a utility play, and I think he's a dude that people see that foul trouble last game, will see that ineffectiveness, and just forget that in game 1, he was a permanent monster in that spot. And I think that's something that I'm willing to buy in the hopes that he can be better, that he's going to recognize like, oh man, if I don't play well here, I'm just not going to see the court. And I think that's a risk spot, Terry. But how are you feeling about Zubac? And I guess, would you consider him in play on FanDuel where he's going to be 7% owned?
It's a stretch on FanDuel. That is a big price to pay for questionable minutes. We've got him projected for around 24 minutes. I think there's certainly a path for him to see that and potentially squeeze in a few more, but there's also the path in the opposite direction. So I like him a hell of a lot better for 5,100 and 3,400 on the DK slate. And yeah, I think he'd be viable at captain. I think he'd be definitely in play in the flex spot. In that crunch that I ran across 500 lineups, no randomness, no nothing, he came up basically double what we've got the projected public ownership for him at. He's at 45% across those. So if you're considering those 500 just off the top optimal lineups, he is very, very much in play on that slate. He's coming in under Marcus Morris, who, like I said, I liked better as the least expensive viable play, but I wasn't really considering Zubac. And as I was saying that, you're paying less for Zubac, and he's got similar story points behind why you would play him in terms of you've got a captain now who's only 5,100. That allows you to build in a lot of those building blocks, kind of like you were describing. Yeah, maybe we've got a thin slice on top from our captain, but now we've got 4 big building blocks underneath from all of our other guys that are going to push us up so that our tower is taller than the other tower that the guys are building with smaller slices across the board, if you think about it just visually that way. So I think it makes some sense to consider both Morris and Zubac in that captain role for double, triple the projected ownership of the field. And even if you do that with both guys, you've still got the vast majority of your lineups, if you're building 150 lineups, where you can plug in the Paul George, the Kawhi Leonard captain plays, and just play your stars in your captain spots and build all your other creative lineups. It's not like it's going to eat up a giant share of your lineups to get well over the field on those guys in the captain spot. And you're going to be building some interesting, some very differentiated lineups that way. So I like both of those guys.
Yeah, so that's where I am with it too. And Zubac will be my most overexposed player overall in the slate. And I'll have more Marcus Morris relative to the field at captain, but I'll have more Zubac at captain in the field by, it looks like about 5x. He's projected to be 3% owned at captain. And I think that's worth to me getting to 15% for my exposures at least. And again, yeah, you guys could say play a little less risk. If you're trying to play with less risk, the field will be at 30% of Ivica Zubac on DraftKings. So, maybe get a little bit above that, be with that, whatever the case is. But I think there's a very obvious pathway to Zubac being good today. Obviously, we need a starting lineup here, which we have not gotten yet for this game, unless something's come through throughout the course of this show. Let me just make sure we haven't got anything through the course of this show yet. So stay tuned to Live Before Lock. If Zubac doesn't start, I think that does move around a little bit. He's still an interesting tournament option, but not quite to me as much of a core play. But if the assumption is that he starts one more time here, I'm willing to take the chance here that he's just not going to get in foul trouble. D Owens 89 asking about punt captain, Cousins or Beverly. Those two guys to me would not be in play. And I guess there's more, honestly, I don't think there's a logic to either. I guess there could be more of a Cousins logic where maybe Zubac isn't good or gets in the foul trouble and they still want to play big. But that second half last game where they didn't go to Cousins worries me, where I just feel like those are the kind of trends you could look at more. Follow the second half of games, follow how it goes. And I think when you see a guy who played in the first half and was fine, but then didn't get that run in the second half, that tells me he's not a core part of what they're trying to do. And if he does get minutes, it's going to be out of desperation. And I'm not trying to target desperation. So to me, neither guy would be my captain, Terry. But if I had to choose, I guess I would go Beverly. But how do you feel about Beverly and Cousins? And would you even be an option for you at all, captain on DraftKings?
I mean, dangling over a pit of vipers to save my life here, it would be Beverly just because Alex has him projected for twice the minutes. So that's the way I would play it, but I don't really like either one of them at captain. If you want to talk to me about building them into the flex positions where they cost 1,600 and 1,400 respectively, it's the same conversation we were having about Miaoni and George Niang. Yeah, there's viability there, but at the captain spot, we're really starting to stretch it. Boogie Cousins is a phenomenal point per minute player, but he's projected for 6 minutes. So you're not getting enough. He's a 1.43 point per minute player for the playoffs. That's leading the entire slate. He's just not going to be out there enough. If you've got a narrative in mind and maybe you set aside a few shares out of your 150 lineups if you want to have that narrative in mind where, yeah, Zubac gets in foul trouble and he's just kind of got to be out there for whatever reason, then could it happen? Sure. If Boogie Cousins sees 15 minutes in this game, could he put up a very viable score for your captain role? Absolutely. He is that kind of a point per minute monster when he's motivated, when he's seeing time. I just really, really question the minutes. So I would go with the quote unquote relative safety of Patrick Beverley and his 12-minute projection if I'm deciding between the two. But it's not for me at the captain spot. There's risk, and then there's intelligent risk, and then there's just wild, just for the hell of it kind of risk. And those guys are more the wild, just for the hell of it kind of risk at the captain spot.
Pat J saying, does FanDuel get any info or is the show all about DK? We're talking about both, but I'm playing only DK today. So I'm trying to obviously talk a little more about what I'm playing personally, but FanDuel we have talked about throughout. I feel like FanDuel single games though, and obviously, you know, it's still fun to play on there. It's still a good time. Just a little more binary with how you have to approach them with the MVP slot and the fact you're not paying more salary for these guys. But for what it's worth, I'm sure Greg will talk more about it on Live Before Lock coming up here. And we do have the ownership that we talked about where it is going to be a lot of Paul George and Kawhi as the MVPs, Donovan Mitchell less as the MVPs, and then the star ownership will be kind of the same range here. Those guys get a little bit closer to flat, but Mitchell and MVP, I think is an interesting move on FanDuel today, given the fact that he's going to be played much less on there as we talked about a 50% ownership share. But yeah, we're just kind of talking about the plays generally, and I'm talking about my exposures for DK for the night. So sorry if you feel like the FanDuel is getting a short shrift here.
I've never been part of a why are you guys not talking about FanDuel conversation. Usually I'm going to FanDuel too much and not talking about DK enough. So that was refreshing. Look, if you want to talk FanDuel just real quick, sure. In that same format, running a crunch 500 lineups, no randomness, no nothing, it came up 50% Kawhi MVP, 47% Paul George MVP, and 3% Donovan Mitchell MVP, and nobody else. To put in perspective how much I enjoy playing FanDuel single game slates, I hand-built just to get a feel for this, one lineup for this, and I didn't have any one of those three guys in the captain spot, the MVP spot. I actually went with Gobert in the MVP spot, just looking for that total oddball. Like I said, I think he's the only other viable guy to potentially have a monster fantasy point game, and nobody's going to be on him, 7% projected ownership in the MVP. If you want to start talking about some of those other positions, that's where it gets a little bit interesting for FanDuel. You don't have the salary multiplication, but you do have those point multipliers where some of the guys from the mid-range, like your Bojans, like your Ingles and your Clarksons, become a little bit relevant. You can start working those guys into the star spot, into more the pro spot, where I think it starts to make some sense. Maybe you offset one of the four big stars in this game to the flex position, and you start working some of these other guys into some of your pro spot and your star spot. By that same token, you're building very different lineups if you're building Paul George or Kawhi Leonard into your pro spot, still getting a little bit of a multiplier out of them. But now you're taking one of those superstar players and you're only playing them up against a small portion of the field in that position. So there are ways to put together unique lineups on FanDuel. It's just a little bit less interesting just based on the way that they do it. Looking at some of those spots in that crunch, it was very much focused toward Paul George and Kawhi again at the top of the star position, with Mitchell pulling a little bit more and then trickling to some Rudy Gobert and a few shares of your Jordan Clarksons, Bojans, Joe Ingles, Marcus Morrises of the world. And then that stretches out more at the pro spot and focused to Rudy Gobert at the top and Joe Ingles. But that's mostly because the way that Fantasy Cruncher is putting it together, it's using so much Kawhi and Paul George in the first two spots that it wasn't getting to them in pro spot. So if you're thinking in terms of building anti-optimizer type lineups, maybe that's where you start getting to some of those offset shares of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard at your pro spot instead of the Rudy Gobert, Joe Ingles of the world. Just kind of one way to build for FanDuel.
Yeah, no, that was, I think, a good encapsulation here. And again, Greg will talk more about it with Eytan coming up on the show next. Eytan demanding it in the chat. So the good news is Eytan now, you can hold him to the fire. If he's not talking FanDuel every minute of that show, then you have carte blanche to tee off on all the Philly teams and make Eytan feel bad about himself, even though I guess Philly's running kind of hot right now. So what would he feel bad about that? What would that guy here with all his good looks and quality hosting, how's he going to feel bad? Stay tuned for those guys coming up next year on Live Before Lock in about 4 minutes. They will yield the way to both Greg and Eytan here on the channel. But let's talk about the rest of these guys. Nick Batum, Reggie Jackson, two names we haven't hit on yet. I think really the only two relevant names. I guess we should carve out a minute here for both Luke Kennard and Rondo at the end. But Reggie Jackson, to me, the play on both DraftKings and FanDuel, and in particular DraftKings, under-owned. I think people maybe don't want to pay that price tag. This is one of those things too, where it wouldn't shock me if the field's a little bit heavier than our ownership projection, where we have him at 18.3 right now. And I do think the casual player field is going to be a little more comfortable with Reggie Jackson based upon him shooting really incredibly well throughout all the series so far and playing above his head in a way that is noteworthy. His usage rate's actually been up from where it was in the regular season. I haven't pinned at 23% usage for this game today, but he's been sometimes, around 25%. I think shy of 28% in a game or two in the playoffs. Like, it's been up enough where I think you have to give him a boost to the season-long numbers. But Reggie, to me, an interesting tournament option, Terry, and I feel like Nick Batum, if you're playing a lot of Zubac like me, the one regret that I have is that Batum is the most direct pivot, I believe, to Zubac, where Zubac, if he doesn't play minutes, they're going to go small. They're going to do what they did in the second half of last game where they went to Batum. Zubac ended up closing that one. And I think Batum is most live in that capacity, but I'm playing the Zubac angle, so that's where my focus is. But tell me your thoughts, Terry. Reggie Jackson and also Nick Batum, are these guys making it for you on FanDuel or in general?
Yeah, Batum and Zubac, the guys that we saw switch out in the starting lineup game 1 to game 2, and then Zubac got in foul trouble and Batum came in pretty quickly, played most of the game. So that's kind of the risk that you run if you're going to Zubac in that spot. Zubac looks like didn't play in the fourth quarter there either, so it was just I think he had 4 fouls in those limited minutes. So you do run into that risk. The cost is there, of course, but I think Batum makes a lot of sense for 6,300 at the captain's, 6,300 at the captain spot is in play. I think he makes a lot of sense to spread some shares at 4,200 across the flex positions, and he's not at a really high level of ownership where you can exceed him in terms of getting to, let's say he's at around 30%. If you're at like 45, somewhere in that neighborhood, it's pushing it. You're getting a little high out there, but it's not like you have to stretch to too much of a degree to at least gain a little bit of ground on the field. And he doesn't have to do all that much for the flex salary. So I think he's in play on the flex spot on DK. And then Reggie Jackson, I think, is something of an anti-optimizer play just based on how much he's not coming up in this crunch. Only 7% overall on the DK crunch across 500 lineups. So it's just the salary, I feel like, is freezing him out. So if you want to make that specific decision as you're building lineups and try and get him into more, there's definitely a path to upside there. There's plenty of minutes projected for him and potentially a little bit more on the table. Like you said, potentially a little bit of an uptick in usage. He's been draining his shots. There's every reason in the world to like him here. So you're just paying up a little bit to do it. But I think it makes some sense to get to him and to force him into some more lineups than we're seeing him land in these in what's coming up in the crunch.
And then to close it out here, and make sure you're following at Awesemo_com. Check out the pin tweet we have going there where we have some details going with our new handle for both best ball and season long at Awesemo Fantasy is going on. So make sure to follow at Awesemo_com, follow at Awesemo Fantasy, because we have some fun promotions going on for both of those here to promote that new handle, getting into football season early. But Rajon Rondo, just want to talk about him real fast before we yield to the Live Before Lock crew with Greg and Eytan coming on right after. Rondo, to me, not getting minutes last game. This is something where I always religiously follow our Awesemo minutes projections. But today we have Rondo in for 4.7 minutes because they're looking at sort of a longer term sample size of what these situations look like in games where all the players are available in these situations. I took Rondo's minutes away because I think he hurts Reggie Jackson's outlook in a way that I don't want to play Rondo. I don't think you can feel confident in him getting minutes. I think the wind's been blown against him in both these series where his defense is so bad. But to me, Terry, I took Rondo in my player pool and as a result got to the Reggie Jackson amount that I'm comfortable with. But how are you feeling about Rondo, and would you take any stabs on him or I guess Luke Kennard to close us out here before we go to Live Before Lock?
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that one. I would, if I'm making a guess on Rondo, it would be to take him off the board entirely rather than say, all right, he's going to play 12 minutes where he'd be at all relevant. The only thing it does is hurt Reggie Jackson by leaving him in. So I'm 100% with you on that one. Kennard's not out of play. Doesn't look like he's going to be owned at all. not the best player in the world, 0.64 fantasy points per minute for the playoffs. We've got him projected for just under 10 minutes. I think there are better value plays on the board, so I don't know that we need to get to him. But since he's not going to be owned, could I mix him in more than the 1.7% ownership that we've got for him? Sure. I think that makes a little bit of sense for the cost, but he's not a go-to by any means.
And at some of the top props to close it out, Ivica Zubac over 5.5 rebounds, 75% win rate according to Awesemo. Ivica Zubac over 0.5 assists, the number 2 bet on the Clippers, 72% win rate for that. So hopefully Awesemo believing in Zubac pays out for me. And a Reggie Jackson over 2.5 rebounds, a 70% win percentage. Some of these rebounds and assist props for guys like Zubac or Reggie Jackson, not the sexiest thing, but again, great win rates here. So play them. Check out the props tool on Awesemo.com. And stay tuned. Coming up next, you have Eytan and Greg. Make sure to follow at DigitalB21 and follow at Chris Spags before you go. We'll see you guys again soon. Stay tuned here on this link. Good luck, guys.
All right, welcome. We keep it going here on Awesemo as we get you ready for lock. We're less than an hour live before lock, and it's not just me. Thank goodness you have Greg Ehrenberg in the house to get you prepared for all of the different obvious and maybe some subtle moves. And yeah, there's a bunch of things happening right now outside of the NBA that we all have eyes on, depending on what it may be. So we appreciate you spending some time here. And look, you should be thanking us, depending on what you have invested in, for hanging with you as well. But no, in all seriousness, one big game, all of the approach that is the Showdown MVP mode, as well as trying to figure out exactly how this series, from narratives to just the lines itself, where you should be going odd shopper, of course, across the board. The show brought to you by Prize Picks. We'll tell you all about that coming up. But first and foremost, the man that you are going to be listening to for the next 55 minutes or so is Greg Ehrenberg. What's happening, man?
Not too much. We got UFC on tonight. I know you're sweating a baseball game. So yeah, a whole lot going on. And then we've got, this one game basketball slate too. So Utah Clippers. Which way do you lean on who's going to win this game? Currently, we do have the Clippers kind of surprisingly favored by 5 points.
Yeah, and I know that it's a big line, especially this deep in the playoffs. They're down 2 points. It's almost disrespectful, I think, to Utah to be getting 5 on the road the way they've played. But this particular game, I kind of have a feel that the Clippers are going to win. I don't think they're going to beat Utah. I don't think that they walk away victorious ultimately in this series, Greg, but I do feel kind of like a typical game 3 swing for the Clippers, especially kind of being back at home. So I don't mind pre-flop laying the 5 if I had to, but look, I think a lot of this has always been first quarter, kind of seeing how it goes. The Clippers have been up, right? A couple of first quarters in this series and then have found a way to lose. So that's where I think I would kind of wait and see. And you probably would lose some value, but again, it's going to come right back down at some point. Utah's going to make a run. I do like the Clippers, but I wouldn't lay the 5 pre-tip per se.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. And the other thing is I'm a very big Mike Conley guy. I think that Conley is pretty underrated in general by the public, and he's been very valuable to this Utah team. But the issue is that the Clippers are already favored by 5 points. Like I was hoping that maybe there'd be a scenario where, maybe we'd have Utah favored or something like that on the road, and then Mike Conley get rolled out and I could bet the Clippers. But I mean, here's Conley for the season. When he's off the court, the Clippers, the Jazz score 3.5 less points per 100 possessions with him on the bench, and they allow 9.7 more points per 100 possessions without Conley on the court. So I think he's really underrated. I think he's valuable to the team, but it's kind of already baked into the line at this point.
Well, I think you actually raise a really interesting point, Greg, about Conley and the impact of tonight's game, especially how the series has gone, where tempo has been dictated a lot. As we know, the Clippers want to play as slow as possible. The total has only dropped about a point. That I do feel, I think, the most confident, and outside of a couple of player props that we'll bring up tonight, that's where I think I feel the most confident right now is if I were going to make a pre-tip, pre-flop per se bet, it would be going under 222, just because now in LA, I think it's an even stronger chance that the tempo is slowed down.
Interesting. I have to be honest, I very rarely bet totals. I bet sides a lot. Totals. There are certain situations where I know there's certain players that have massive implications on the pace of the game. Like if you look at the Golden State Warriors, for example, with Steph Curry on versus off the court, there's a massive difference in the pace that they play. So when he's out, I might expect some of those games to see the total drop by 8 or 9 points, especially because Curry's so good on offense. But there aren't that many games where I really feel great about betting totals. So what is it specifically that you expect the Clippers to be playing slower paced?
I just think that we've seen this so far, the 2 games in Utah where totals have hit under, and now back in LA, I think it's going to even be a little more comfortable for the Clippers to play at that clip. Not to say, look, I think everybody wants to drop $150, but I think there's going to be 2, I hate to use the term narratives here, but I think 2 playoff themes that I could subscribe to. One is that I do think the Clippers are in command for the majority of this game. I do think the Clippers win this game, even if it's not a cover. I like LA to win this game, but I also just like things to be slowed down even more so than what we've seen. I could see a 98-90 type game towards the end of the fourth quarter. I could see even like a 108 to 98 type finish, something along those lines if the Clippers pull away. But that's kind of where I was looking at. And again, 222 with the total only dropping 1. We've seen lower scoring games. That's where I thought maybe there would be some angle pre-tip. But again, this thing slows down and you're going to be in a good shape if you hit the under. But if they come out firing, something we haven't really seen, then all of a sudden that total is going to jump up.
Yeah, and by the way, to reference your point, for the Clippers did play the 28th overall total pace in the league, so 3rd slowest in the NBA, and Utah Jazz slightly below average. They played at the 16th fastest pace. So definitely overall, I would expect that, just looking at those numbers, to be a below average scoring game.
All right, you got to give me a little credit, man. You're a numbers guy. Very rarely do I subscribe to numbers. I'm all over the place in the radio mode of narratives and everything, but at least I had a little substance there with that, right?
No, hey, I mean, they play. I wasn't really exactly sure what pace these teams play at off the top of my head, but yeah, we're right there. Clippers, 28th in pace this season.
All right, hit us up. Make sure we continue here. We'll honor Spags' request, by the way, to touch on as many FanDuel lineups as humanly possible. I know Greg, myself, a lot of us kind of shade more towards DraftKings just by nature. But look, across the board, we need your help. We don't ask for much, right? It's a like, it's a subscription. Those do miles for us. Really, it's an amazing way that you can continue to help us is just make sure you're subscribed. I know you are. I'll do it next show. I'll do it next show. This is it tonight. So make sure if you haven't done it already, you're locked in with the subscription here. Awesemo Plus will continue to tell you about a great opportunity across the week. But really tonight, it's $29.95 for everything. But we do have an opportunity for you to get in Awesemo Plus Platinum. Your first week is 15% off. Awesemo Plus Platinum, NBA Live Before Lock. That's all you need. NBA Live Before Lock. It's the name of this show. Use that. You can also use a free tool tonight, which is the NBA player rankings, but we'll be talking a lot about ownership and everything across the board. All right, so where to begin, my friend? I know that this slate has been exhausted throughout the day, and there have been a lot of different, from Terry just recently and Spags to myself and Adam this morning on the strategy show, but we are getting closer. We are getting closer. A couple of things are kind of definitive. One, we know, no Mike Conley. We're kind of waiting for Zubac, right, as far as the official word of the starting lineup. I don't see that quite yet, and if you did, then please correct me, but we're kind of waiting, or we're kind of dealing, I should say, with those two variables, I think, coming into the game tonight, right?
Yeah, so my current expectation is that Zubac will start tonight. The starting lineup for the Clippers last game, I'll bring it up just so I make sure I have all of the players right. But Zubac started in place of Nick Batum. And then outside of that, we had the other regular starters for the Clippers. So it was Paul George, Reggie Jackson, Kawhi Leonard, Marcus Morris, and then Zubac starting at center. Now, the Zubac minutes, I think, are very misleading from last game. I think a lot of people will look at them and say, like, oh, Zubac only played 14 minutes, therefore he's not going to play a whole ton tonight. I don't think that's the case. I don't think he's going to play, 35 minutes or anything like that, but he picked up 2 fouls 3 minutes into the game, very quickly headed to the bench, ended up getting 4 fouls for the game, and that really prohibited his playing time. I think we see him play over 20 minutes today, assuming he starts, which is currently my expectation. And when I'm assuming my projections, if we end up getting a different starting lineup, then everything I'm going to be talking about for the next 30 minutes is going to be just totally dead and pointless. But hey, that is the nature of NBA DFS. But yeah, I think Zubac does start, and I actually do think that he's the best overall value play on this slate.
Okay, so let's start there. Now, I think as far as working him in as utility player, clearly there's plenty of room, especially trying to maneuver through captain mode. And clearly, as far as we've been talking about throughout the day, and it's continuing to be echoed here on our ownership projections, everybody loves Paul George as the captain. But as far as a high ceiling, I crunched a couple just based off our own projections with the highest ceiling. Zubac is right there as far as coming up right away, a couple of captain modes. I know you want to get to him a lot as far as exposure on your lineups, but how about as far as a captain?
Yeah, so the question is, do I want to roster Paul George as a captain? Or
no,
Zubac?
Yeah. I was saying we'll get to George in a sec, but just on the same vein of what you brought up with Zubac, I think that there are paths to him when I'm crunching lineups tonight as far as high ceilings to work where he could pay off exponentially as a captain. Now, the trade-off is that you're not going to be able to get 3 or all 4 of the top 4 guys. You're going to have to sacrifice one of those.
Well, if you have Zubac a captain, you could certainly play all the top guys. I mean, you could play Zubac a captain and comfortably fit, Paul George, Donovan Mitchell, Kawhi Leonard together. You can't get Rudy Gobert really in there also comfortably. However, I think that Rudy Gobert is quite a step back from those 3 guys. So that is the nice thing about rostering Zubac as captains. You can fit those 3 guys in. The only thing I'll say with that is if you are playing Zubac as captain, let me see what the most recent ownership is with him at captain. Everybody else is going to be playing those 3 guys. So even though it seems like it might be a little bit contrarian, it might not actually be because everybody else is going to fitting in some of those same players. But Zubac a captain, I still do think it makes some sense. You just have to leave salary on the table somewhere with one of the other guys, just so you don't have a lineup that's massively duped by everybody.
Yeah, you have to get to Bogdanovich before you get anybody in the 30s as far as ownership percentage that we have projected on DraftKings, not from a captain standpoint, but just overall utility slot outside of those 4, the big 4 that you're naming. And Paul George is even beyond what we have. Kawhi Leonard, clearly there's a difference as far as a grand, but just continuing with this theme of the variable at the top for a captain, does the ownership at any point, and especially when you look at Zubac personally, right? We haven't projected just at 27%. So are you looking at anybody else that might be a little bit higher as far as another variable at captain? And we can get to lower punt guys in a second, Greg, but I'm just curious, kind of moving up a little bit on the cost. So if it's Ingles, right, knowing of course what's going on, if it's Bogdanovich as well, knowing what's going on without Conley, is there a path to, or even maybe a Morris or Batum, depending on the other side, kind of that middle cost range? Is there a path to a captain there? Or are you strictly using those guys in your utility spots?
Yeah, so to me, the guys you mentioned, no. So Marcus Morris is actually fairly popular at captain. He is the most popular captain who isn't one of the studs to pay up for. So Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, they're in a tier of their own. Of Donovan Mitchell, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, they're in a tier of their own. Then there's some captain ownership going to Rudy Gobert at 10%. And then the next most owned captain right now, we have Marcus Morris. So with that in mind, it's not like there's some great ownership discount by playing Morris. He's going to be fairly popular today. He's also the most popular cheap option overall, projecting for over 40% ownership. So to me, with Marcus Morris, it's not really a contrarian play I want to make. Also, I don't think there's all that much upside in him. I'd either rather go all the way cheap with Ivica Zubac, or if I'm going down, I know you mentioned Batum. The issue I have with Batum, if he starts, sure. But we've seen his minutes get pretty limited in this series relative to what we saw in the last series, just because matchup against Rudy Gobert, the Clippers are a little more hesitant to play small. And I think that's the case going forward as long as they start Zubac again. So if I was to go really off the board with a captain play, it would probably be Derek Favors, who's projecting for almost no ownership as a captain today. Favors absolutely sucked the other day, but he's really cheap, and he is a pivot off of Zubac, where I don't think that we're going to see Favors go out and score, 30 fantasy points or anything like that. But we could see out of Favors today is, let's say he scores 15 fantasy points, but all of the big guys have massive games. Then you might need those salary savings.
All right, we have a couple on the super chat here. It's the easiest way, most direct way to get to us, really, to Greg, and then also on the premium Slack as well. Again, $29.95 a week. Awesemo Plus, you have access to so many great tools and ways in which you can interact with us. So let's hit the super chat up real quick. Bryson Henry asks, 2 locks at utility in a large field DK GPP.
Let's see. Where's 2 locks? I mean, to me, there's nobody that I'm locking particularly for a single entry slate. I'll say the players I have the most exposure to are Kawhi Leonard and Donovan Mitchell, but I don't have anybody 100%. So if you're playing one lineup and you want to know who the guys I have the most exposure to, it's Kawhi and Mitchell. But if you're playing multiple lineups, it's pretty hard to lock anybody in 100% on a showdown slate, unless it's just some guy who's randomly starting at mint price or something like that.
Are you underweight to the field with Paul George because he's so heavily owned?
Let's see.
Last I saw, I mean, again, he's popping up on our projections as far as Cruncher across the board. As far as captain, we have him at 24.5%.
So I have less exposure to the field than Paul George, but I have Paul George 75% and the field has him 90%. So, I mean, if you're playing 10 lineups and you don't put Paul George in all of them, then you're not overweight to the field. He's somebody who's very difficult with this ownership to really get overweight to.
All right, Blake Rubin, $900 remaining on DraftKings. All right, Ingles or O'Neal? We know Conley out.
I mean, both those guys cost more than $900, so not exactly.
Oh,
sure
I thought that.
But
I'm sorry, Greg. I thought that's what he meant. Like 900 left in his account, and he's just going to let it fly. So he needs one more lineup to lock in.
Listen, I mean, if those are the two guys, I have Joe Ingles projected for far more fantasy points. So that's the guy. I'm maybe a little confused by the question, unless he just means his lineup has $900 left in it.
Yes,
which to me is not problematic at all for a showdown. If that's what the question is. Now I'm reading it, and yeah, I think that's. So his lineup is $900 left, and he wants to know whether he should roster Joe Ingles or Royce O'Neal. To me, the answer is Joe Ingles. And for Showdown, I have lineups that leave thousands on the table. It's not a big deal.
Yeah. Is there a number where, I mean, I guess it really depends on who you're working in and how you're getting to that, to where if the difference of Patrick Beverley and maybe it's I don't know if it's the best example, but Kennard or somebody maybe like O'Neal is probably a better one, where there's a gap of $1,800, but you're better off running with Beverly because of the minutes and the projection and the cost itself. Then you're not looking back with any remorse of leaving what, 1,200, 1,500 on the board. Where does it get a little dicey for you?
Yeah, I mean, so let me see who's somebody who'd be an example. Like, so Ivica Zubac is 3,400. I have him projected for more fantasy points than Nick Batum. I have him projected for almost the exact same fantasy points as Royce O'Neal. So if you wanted to leave, $2,000 on the table to go from Royce O'Neal to Ivica Zubac to have a lineup that leaves a bunch of salary on the table, I don't think there's a massive trade-off there. I have them projected very similarly, assuming that Zubac ends up starting. So that's the way that I think is, reasonable to be contrarian by leaving salary on the table.
Let's look at a scenario here, because I think that as much as we prepare for one, especially because you're heavy on it, and I'm not trying to bring up any type of bad mojo or direct this conversation in real life to him not starting, but I just want to prepare for everything, right? So let's assume now in a hypothetical, Greg, that Zubac is not starting tonight. How does that change, and how do you now approach the slate, the game?
So it depends who starts in place of him, right? So that brings
Batum,
a whole.
We think, right?
It would be Batum. I know some people in the chat are bringing up, could DeMarcus Cousins potentially start? I tend to think no, although I can't say that's completely off the table. But yeah, so if Batum does start, a couple of things happen. Number one, that takes Zubac basically out of play for me. And all my lineups, everything gets redone. Everything goes to shit. So don't want that to happen, because then we have to redo everything on the air. And
I had to ask. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that becomes no fun. But if Zubac doesn't start, he's out of play. DeMarcus Cousins also totally out of play. Nick Batum becomes a stronger play, but then also that means we're probably seeing more small ball lineups from the Clippers overall. So that would bring somebody like Luke Kennard into play also, because now we'd just be expecting there to be more wings that get minutes. So there's a trickle down effect that would impact a lot of guys, not just the two players who swap in the starting lineup.
Is there, and you mentioned Kennard, so we start to look at guys on, and we'll look at it again, just as far as the Zubac starting mentality, but I'm just curious to follow up here. How deep do you start to get now, taking advantage of some expanded minutes with Zubac not starting, or just the roster as far as it changing, the rotation changing depending on who starts?
Yeah, so it's just going to totally depend on who starts. And once again, though, I think it's going to be Zubac who starts. And, right now, we do have an hour to talk about one game. So there's a lot of scenarios where we could break down, but I basically have everything set as Zubac starting now. And the other thing also is, it's easy enough to adjust because it's a one game slate. So it's not like there's no late swap going on. There's no sort of strategy we have to consider, what if we already have players locked in? So, almost from a content perspective, it'd almost be more interesting if Zubac doesn't start, because then we could react to it on the air and figure out what to make of it. But for right now, I recommend build all your lineups assuming Zubac starts.
Be careful what you ask for, okay? Because that's going to come down, and you're going to be visibly pissed off, squirming to change all the things that you basically have told us that you don't want to. And yes, it's going to be great theater, but it's going to be at your expense. So I'm just making sure you realize this.
Hey, it doesn't matter to me. I'll be able to adjust. I could do these things quickly. It would certainly be annoying, but yes. I could handle a little heat. I'm not Eric Lindquist. I'm not going to start crying on the show.
Wait a second.
I could deal with it.
Yes, at no point. You've been on stage, stand-up comedian in New York City, so I have no doubt that you can handle heat, and you can handle heckling, and you can handle I see you handle this chat whenever we work together. So I did not mean to insinuate that you couldn't handle it, but what I did mean to state overtly and outward is that it's going to frustrate the hell out of you, and it's going to be very visible on your face.
Listen, I've been doing
nice shot at Eric, by the way. There's always stray bullets. People are always getting hit. I've been doing, I did a show in a basement bar in New York City during SantaCon, where somebody dressed up as Santa Claus walked up to the stage and threw up all over it. And I just had to do another 20 minutes as if nothing happened. I just have to carry on. Like, obviously we address, we figure out, but now the whole room smells terrible. I still have a bunch more time to do because that's what I'm obligated to do. So listen, I could deal with it. I could deal with the Clippers changing their starting lineup. Fair enough. My goodness, man. I thought the Eagles fans booing Santa was the best Santa story I've ever heard, but that might have just taken the cake right there. Jeez. All right,
just the drop in the bucket. There's so many stories.
SantaCon is real. EMAC didn't realize that SantaCon is real. No, it's very real, Greg. Tell him.
Oh, it is. It is real. It is the dumbest thing ever. It's just people. I don't know if it's in other cities, but
No.
or if it still exists now. It probably didn't last year with COVID and whatnot. But people literally just dress up as Santa Claus in like the middle of summer or spring or whatever. So already it's like 90 degrees out and people are dressed in full Santa costumes. Women with still like the Santa Claus beard, and they just get shit faced and wreak havoc in the streets of New York. It's the dumbest holiday ever. Like, it would be just as fun if people weren't dressed as Santa Claus.
Hey, take over Washington Square Park. What club were you down in McDougal? Where were you?
Yeah, actually, it was really close. It was the Village Lantern, which is it's one block over from McDougal. It's on it's right around the corner from the Comedy Cellar. I forget the name of the street though.
Okay, I know exactly. Ben's Pizza is still there. It's one of the best pizza spots in the entire planet. Look at this, man. See, you are prepared for the Zubac change. By all means, if anybody on this chat thought otherwise, I want to take you back to where we began as far as Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, especially Donovan Mitchell. And let's start. We do have to honor, because I know Spags is just waiting right now for us to get halfway through the show and say, where is the FanDuel? You promised us FanDuel. But let's start captain mode here. Who do you have the most exposure to tonight as far as a captain is concerned, outside of maybe a punt, or if you're working Zubac in on a couple of lineups, one of the top guys?
Let's see. Sorted captain, Kawhi Leonard. So I think that he makes for, and by the way, Kawhi Leonard is still the second most popular captain, but there's so much ownership going to Paul George as the captain right now. I know somebody asked before, why is Paul George projected higher than Kawhi Leonard? To be clear, Kawhi Leonard is projected for more fantasy points. It's just the salary savings that Paul George offers that currently has Paul George projected for more ownership in the captain spot than Kawhi Leonard does. Kawhi Leonard is still projected for more fantasy points. This is just who's projected for more ownership, and it's a price play. But to me, I think Kawhi Leonard, given the high ownership that we're expecting from Paul George right now, that makes for a good pivot in the captain spot. Because 25% for Paul George, that is so much more exposure than anybody else is getting a captain right now.
You're still, and again, it's not like a fade or slotting him low. You're still getting to a lot of Paul George as far as captain in your lineups. It's just not as many as Kawhi Leonard. And then I imagine Donovan Mitchell is in between the two.
So I have Kawhi 1, Donovan Mitchell 2, Paul George 3, Rudy Gobert 4, and then Ivica Zubac 5.
Can you make, and we'll get to Boss Bruh on the premium Slack, just one second. I'm curious, though, how much of an argument can you make, and it's based off of ownership, based off, it's one game, you're trying to find a variable here, especially to counter Paul George's ownership. So still rostering him, but as far as captain mode is concerned, how much of an argument can you get for Rudy Gobert to get to him over Paul George as a captain simply because of ownership, or mainly as a mitigating factor?
Yeah, so to me, and like I said, I still have more exposure to Paul George in a captain spot than Rudy Gobert. Right now, Paul George projected for about 3x the captain ownership of Gobert. The one issue I have with Gobert in terms of getting more exposure to him than Paul George is that I have Gobert projected for so much less fantasy points than the other all-stars this game. So to me, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Donovan Mitchell, they're in a tier of their own. Then Rudy Gobert is like a second-tier player on this slate, and then it's everybody else behind him. So there's a big drop-off. And to me, Gobert just doesn't quite have the projection to where I'd want to get him more than Paul George.
Are you getting to Gobert, though, a ton in just utility spots simply because he's the only guy really in the second tier and you kind of can't afford to fade?
I think he's a pretty neutral play. Rudy Gobert, we have projected for 50% ownership, overall 10% ownership in the captain spot. That's just about appropriate to me. And that's the case with a lot of plays. Not every play is a good play or a bad play. Some plays are just like, hey, this is about reasonable. And that's where I'm at with Rudy Gobert.
You've opened up this entire new chat. You've definitely made Emacs night. I don't know what else was going on, what else he had planned tonight, but I guarantee you, if he's not already simultaneously in this chat, he's gone down a SantaCon YouTube rabbit hole. And you have opened this up to a ton of people, I'm sure, who had no idea, because to my knowledge, This is only in New York City. And I've been in Philly, Nashville, Columbus. I've lived in a bunch of different spots, and I've never seen a Santa Con. In fact, I've seen other cons take place as far as homage to Santa Con, Francesa Con, and all the other shit cons that you see outside of the big one, Comic Con, which, you know, I'm not ripping. I'm just saying it's separate from that because that travels.
Listen, EMAC 2024, first of all. Second of all, we're not that far from EMAC Con. There's going to be a day, if we get big enough as a YouTube channel, there's going to be a meetup where everybody comes and dresses as EMAC.
Well, look, here's the thing. I know for a fact, I know I'm one of the newest, if not newest members here on the community, but I've seen people show up for that bullshit Francesa Con. So I know for a fact that we could get more people right now today to show up for an EMAC Con at the very least. Now, Santa Con's a little different because EMAC hasn't reached legendary status like Santa quite yet, but I think you're onto something.
Hey, listen, I'm telling you, I think that our audience would go nuts for an EMAC con. I know Marcus Hickman here, not impressed by it because he's saying who cares about any con.
No,
trust me, the people would care about EMAC con.
Look, as far as what's happening tonight on the level of care, I'm not sure if there's anything higher. It might be a UFC fight for Greg. It might be this Yankees game for me. But I can tell you that EMAC and now EMAC Con has moved itself up very high in our list of priorities here. We may not get to Marcus Morris by the end of the show now that we know our job here is to get EMAC Con going.
Hey, listen, I'm for EMAC Con. Let's see. Well, let's set the 100,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel, and that's when I think that that's when I think that's when EMAC Con happens. 100,000
destination in mind.
EMAC's house. We're all just gonna show up on his front lawn.
Oh, I love it, man. Just let me know time and place. We'll be there. All right. Show as promised is brought to you by Prize Picks. We'll tell you everything that you can now take advantage of here. It's awesome. You can say goodbye to the Sharks, the optimal lineups, the mass multi-entry, and just take advantage of picking 2, 3, 4, or 5 players available on the board to go over or under their projected score. That's it. Correctly selecting a 5-player lineup will net you up to 10 times your entry fee. NFL, NBA, esports, everything going on that you can take advantage of. Prize Picks has it. It'll combine your picks across all sports. Just look, you can download the app, whatever your marketplace of choice is, and make your first deposit. Guess what? We have a deal for you, as always, right? To receive an instant deposit match of up to $100 when you use our promo code Awesemo. That's it. It's that simple, right? Awesemo deposit match up to $100. You should be able to do some serious damage. If you drop 100 of your own, you get that matched with us. Use our promo code, and that'll take you a long way. Again, it's overs, it's unders. It's simple. We talk about overs and unders all the time with projections here, including we mentioned Rudy Gobert kind of being that safe play, if you will, kind of where he is. He is total. I saw last on Odd Shopper at 13.5. And it's juiced to the under, which I was a little surprised about. So there's value on the over. And I'm thinking just on the surface, it's not a terrible play based off of the matchup. I don't know, though, your belief, and we're all going to have this mental mojo towards Zubac is starting. So Greg's life isn't completely derailed for the next 20 minutes. But matchup and value combined, any thoughts on going over 13.5 with me?
13.5. Let me see. Let me check.
It's not terrible.
13.5. That is almost exactly what I have projected. That's very.
Now, are you over? Fair. Are you like 13.55? Are you like 13.25? Where are you on the decimal point to make me feel better about this bet here?
13.3.
All right, so we're under.
Not really.
All right, no, real quick. And I'm curious because no house advantage. We have this a lot where we have Odd Shopper as well is awesome because you can see the X-win percentage and where Odd Shopper truly believes this is going to fall. But I'm curious, just because you bring this up in conversation, if you were to tell me, like if I'm using your projections for player props tonight, Greg Ehrenberg has Rudy Gobert at 13.3. That's a stay away from me because you're so tight on the number. Is that kind of how you would approach it as well? Or are you looking at any small decimal point advantage that you can take and use in your own favor?
No, because keep in mind also there's a vig involved with any of this, right? So you don't just need to be better than what the number is. You need to be better than it by a certain percentage. Because if the number you have, 13.4, then sure, maybe it goes under the 13 and a half, 48 times out of 50, 48 times out of 100, but that's not, or 52 times out of 100. But even though it's more than half, that's not enough for it to be a profitable play.
All right, so we're going to stay away. The value's on the over, but you're right. I think from that standpoint alone, trust me, I got a couple others. I'm going to slide in here, including one with Kawhi Leonard that kind of jumped out. Let's go back to Mitchell, though, and kind of where you're approaching Donovan Mitchell. I know captain mode as well, but in the backdrop of what we had on the premium Slack from Boss Bra, as far as one of your top favorite MVP picks across the board on FanDuel. And now we can, at very least, say to the critics and the haters out there, Spags and others, we satisfied the FanDuel requirement.
Hey, we've got 24 minutes left. People have questions, whatever they want to ask about. They want to ask about FanDuel, they want to ask about DraftKings. We could talk about all of them. So for FanDuel, the ownership is going to look much different than DraftKings. The reason being is because the salary. There's no difference if somebody's in the MVP spot versus the captain spot, but still we have Paul George picking up a very substantial amount of MVP ownership today. Actually, a number that doesn't really make sense to me. Paul George currently projected for 42% MVP ownership. That's something that I don't agree with. I would much rather roster Kawhi Leonard or Donovan Mitchell at their ownership than Paul George, because I have Kawhi Leonard projected for more fantasy points than Paul George. Yet we have Kawhi at 35% projected ownership in the MVP spot. Paul George projected for 42%. So with that in mind, Kawhi Leonard would be number one. And then Donovan Mitchell also 15%. So about a third of the ownership in the captain spot compared to Paul George. So overall, how I rank the MVP plays on FanDuel would be Kawhi Leonard 1, Donovan Mitchell 2, and then Paul George 3.
Are you surprised that Mitchell is not getting as much exposure really at all to the MVP spot on FanDuel?
Yes, especially given how well he's played as of late, especially with Conley out. So we have in the games that Conley has missed, we have Donovan Mitchell this series. He's had a usage rate over 40%, and he is scoring, 41 points per game in the series or something like that. It is exactly 41 points per game on a 41.7% usage rate for Donovan Mitchell. Considering that we still have Mike Conley out, I mean, I don't think that he's going to continue to score over 40 points per game, but I don't think the usage is going anywhere. I still think he's going to be leading the offense. He's going to be taking a ton of shots. So just given that we have Donovan Mitchell with a third of the ownership in the captain spot compared to Paul George, I think that Donovan Mitchell is the better captain play or MVP play. It's called.
MVP play, right? And then I guess the obvious follow up here may be just where you're working anybody else in that slot on Utah, and maybe just based off our projections, there is this belief that the Clippers, the defense slowing Donovan Mitchell down. I mean, just his player prop I see is up to 31.5.
Burying the lead here. So we have, by the way, the starting lineup. It is Nick Batum starting at center over Ivica Zubac. So, hey, time to change everything. So now we have, listen, everything we said before doesn't matter, irrelevant. We've got the last 22 minutes is basically a new slate now because it's a one game slate and everybody changes.
Do we need Tyler to fade out, like play the music again? I could start and restart the show. Like, is this a brand new program for everybody?
More or less, because, nothing changes on the Utah side, really, because there's nobody whose projection has to change for that. But yeah, the minutes for the Clippers all change now.
Okay,
because
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just take no. I was going to say, honestly, I was just going to throw it back to you because I know this is just going to be a little more complicated than a quick question for me and a response. So just take some time and kind of walk us through what's going through your mind. And now I'm going to throw it back on you because you always hit me up with the dude from It's Always Sunny, where my mind is going crazy when I'm hitting you with these wild props and parlays on the tip off. Your mind is going to be working like that, but I trust that you could simultaneously explain, at least better than I normally do on that show, what's happening here and how you're reworking everything now that Zubac doesn't start.
Yeah, so it's actually not that complicated because this isn't a new scenario, right? Zubac started last game, but with that in mind, Nick Batum had started every other playoff game so far, other than actually game one against the Dallas series. We saw Zubac start in that game, but we saw 5 playoff games in a row. Nick Batum started. So we could just look at the minutes from those games where Batum played. It was only 21 against Utah. Those really changed the rotation. But then games against Dallas, he played 42 minutes, 37 minutes, 33, 36 minutes. So maybe they shade a little bit bigger to try to match up against Rudy Gobert, where they don't want to totally be small all the time. But yeah, I mean, expecting somewhere around Nick Batum to play 30 minutes is totally reasonable. Now, I expect Batum to play more minutes. I expect Luke Kennard to play more minutes. And I think that Zubac and DeMarcus Cousins now are, largely irrelevant.
Zubac and Cousins. Okay, so anybody who has rostered Zubac as a captain needs to change that immediately, correct? Especially because we were trying to take advantage of his boom tonight and also working in the top 3 guys in that lineup as well. So based off of starting lineup, based off of looking at somebody else that's still going to be a variable that's different than the top 3, technically 4 with Gobert in there, does Batum now become a logical choice to captain?
Yes, I don't mind that at all, actually, because I think that there's potential for Batum to play big minutes. His prices come down. So that is also going to give us a lot of salary flexibility to be able to pay up for other guys. And then keep in mind, too, when it comes to Nick Batum, he was just, let me see if I can find the historical pricing here. I'm looking it up in Fantasy Cruncher really quick. So Nick Batum, just a couple of games ago, was priced at 6,000 in Showdown. And now he's down to 4,200. So we have an $1,800 price difference just based on a starting lineup change that went for one game and is now largely irrelevant because they've reverted. So with that in mind, it's just going to be Batum back to more or less the same role he was before when it was determined that a fair price for him was 6,000.
So scenario here now, because we swapped out Batum for Zubac, and I'll give you what I have here real life, right? I've worked Batum in here as a captain, still with Leonard Mitchell. If it's Gobert, if it's George, you'll still have another slot here. But when you start to get to the bottom, you mentioned Zubac becomes largely irrelevant. Is that across the board to where if you have an option to slot as your last guy on a utility for DraftKings tonight, Greg, and you're looking at, forget cost here because it's irrelevant, right? If you're looking at Zubac, if you're looking at Rondo or Kennard or even Terrence Mann, how far down is Zubac now on that list, and who kind of emerges as your top kind of candidate, if you will, favorite guy to slide in that regard?
All right. So the salary on Zubac was 3,400.
Correct. Rondo 32, Kennard 3, Mann 24. I guess you could also make a punt argument for favors at 1,800.
I think Kennard plays the most minutes of those guys, but I don't think any of them are terrific plays. I think Kennard is the most in play, but he's not somebody who I'm going to be dying to play in a whole bunch of lineups. So Kennard is the most viable of those, but I mean, relative to Showdown, that means getting him in, like 20% of lineups.
What does this do for playoff Rondo?
I mean, that dude stinks. Like, what is like, he played here, but also he played 0 minutes last game, right? So yes. How can I reasonably expect him to play a significant amount of minutes? He fell out of the rotation, played 0 minutes last game. And with that in mind, could he come back into the rotation? Sure. Except it's not like he was good from a fantasy perspective in the regular season anyway. For the year, Rajon Rondo averaged 16.3 fantasy points, and he was a DNP coach's decision in a bunch of games. So with that in mind, maybe he plays, maybe he doesn't play, but there's a bunch of things to consider here. So even if he plays, he might not play a lot of minutes. Even if he plays and gets minutes, he might not play well. So the odds of Rondo actually having a big game, it's so small. He played 0 minutes last game, and there's a whole lot that has to go well for me. Even when he played bigger minutes in game 2 of this series, or game 1 of the series, that is, it was Reggie Jackson fouled out in like 17 minutes and got into foul trouble really early, picked up 3 fouls in the first quarter. And that was what had to happen for Rajon Rondo to score 19 fantasy points. So there has to be a whole lot that breaks in favor of Rajon Rondo for him to end up being optimal. And it's not somebody to go to, in my opinion.
Carlos Manzo asked, and this was a little bit earlier, but I kind of wanted to let some time go because you addressed this a couple of times kind of throughout. And I think it's important for you to kind of reinforce why, especially as we see it on the chat and the super chat from Carlos. But again, and I know you've mentioned this a couple of times, but just to reinforce why Paul, outside of maybe the obvious of the cost, why Paul continues to get at least more exposure from an ownership standpoint, if not higher projections than Kawhi.
Well, let's see also if we have an updated ownership since the starting lineup change. I haven't refreshed that yet because it might look different now.
Correct.
Let's see.
I got it here too.
It would help if I click the Showdown slate to refresh and not the
George is still
slate.
pretty high there. Kawhi as well. I mean, George is still at 88.5% projected on DraftKings.
It hasn't been updated since the starting lineup change though.
Yep.
So
good point.
So it could still potentially end up changing. So
do you think George's ownership drops as a result of this change in the lineup?
No, I mean, I think the ownership is like a little bit too high anyway. But I don't think that because of this lineup change, it would change anything.
All right, so let's look at a couple of guys that you like as far as, some lower cost super punt maybe options that you could roster in as a captain to take full advantage of rostering the other four big names and then even working in if it's a Batum or somebody along those lines as your last slot. Is there a super low cost guy? And we mentioned Favors. I know Patrick Beverley was getting a ton of love throughout the day, but are you addressing that at all first and foremost as a strategy? And if so, then who?
If I had to roster one, it would be either Derek Favors or Patrick Beverley. I don't think either of them are exceptional plays, but I do have Derek Favors projected for about one more fantasy point than Beverley, a little less than one fantasy point. But there's also a lot of variance with Patrick Beverley because much like Rajon Rondo, we have seen Beverley out of the rotation. The other thing also is that Beverley has played absolutely awful when he's been on the court, not just in the playoffs, but in the regular season too. Like Beverley is so washed up at this point. Him and Rondo both. So last game, Beverley played 21 minutes. He scored 12 fantasy points. In the series against Dallas, these are the games where he saw minutes coming off the bench. He played 6 minutes and scored 3 fantasy points. He played 5 minutes and scored 4 fantasy points. He played 1 minute and scored 0 fantasy points. And then even in game one of the series, he played 6 minutes and scored 4 fantasy points. So the most fantasy points we've seen out of Beverley in the last 2 weeks is 12 fantasy points. And that would be okay for his price point. I'm just not sure there's that much upside. The last time that Patrick Beverley scored over 20 fantasy points, take a guess on the date.
I'm going to guess, what are we now in June? I'm going to guess March 12th.
April 6th. He scored 20 and a half fantasy points. That is the last time that he went over 20. The time he did it before that was actually March 3rd. Okay. So he's hasn't been a good fantasy producer most of the season. And also keep in mind, he was starting then. Right. So overall for the season, we have Patrick Beverley. This is, by the way, only including games that he actually played. He played 21 minutes per game and averaged 16 fantasy points. And I don't think he's going to play 21 minutes today. And I think there's a chance he plays 0 minutes. I think that he's probably going to be in the rotation, but I don't know that for sure. I think he's more likely than not. So to me, he's a pretty risky play. I prefer Derek Favors to Patrick Beverley just for the point that I know that Derek Favors is going to play some minutes today. I don't know for sure that Patrick Beverley will, even if I think that he's more likely to than not. And by the way, Larry C in the chat says that we just got an ownership update. So we could refresh that and I could see what has changed now. So
and a couple of other tools as well. Boom Bust, I see. And as you can imagine, a couple of guys have kind of shot up there as well as a result of this. Hopefully your UFC night, by the way, is going better than my baseball night. I would just ask it. Look, if I'm not winning, which I'm not, then I'm just going to put it all on your side and root for you now.
I have no clue because I've kind of,
now with the Zubac stuff, you can't coast.
Yes. So I don't know what's going on in the fights. I'll have to check the Slack chat after we're done in 11 minutes. But so the ownership update here.
Yep.
Surprising. I thought Nick Batum was going to be really popular now, and he is not. So Nick Batum is, and obviously relative to Showdown, right? Like 33% ownership. That's a lot for most slates, but for a 1-game slate, that's relatively low owned. He's not one of the 5 or 6 most rostered players. He is 3, 4, 5, 6. He is the 8th most popular player right now. And I think Nick Batum warrants more ownership given the success we've seen from him in the starting lineup for the Clippers. Also only 3% projected ownership as the captain for Nick Batum. That is also something that I like for DraftKings. And actually, surprisingly, we have him fairly similarly projected in ownership to Ivica Zubac. Zubac's projected for 2% ownership in the captain spot, 25.5% ownership overall. So to me, pretty easy to go overweight to Batum and then be off of Zubac now.
quick scenario here based off of what you just talked about with Derek Favors, kind of getting to him at the bottom of those options, and then looking at where you're rostering. You're going to get the top 4 guys in there. There's going to be another slot open. So I just ran through that on a lineup here, and you have the option of Batum and Morris. But I think based on your answer, you're going to side heavily towards Batum over Morris, even though he's moved up as well on our boom bust tool that we have available on Awesemo.
If I have the leftover salary, I still have Marcus Morris projected for more fantasy points than Batum, so he would be the priority.
So he's
there,
the better play. Okay.
But it might be easier to get to Batum just because he's $600 cheaper. And personally, right now, I think he's just going under-owned as a captain at 3.7%. But if salary was no issue, then yeah, I'd rather play Morris than Batum.
Yeah, and that's actually how it works out with Favors rostered as the captain, and then working Mitchell, the 2 Clippers, and Gobert. You're going to have the option of one or the other. So that's why I was asking, just from that standpoint. But yeah, I mean, if that's where you are, then what about working Morris in as a captain tonight? We didn't really look at as far as how often you can get to that, any exposure in that regard with your lineup.
Yeah, he's in the mix for me, but it's not a high priority play. He is now projected for 5.7% ownership at the captain spot. That seems about reasonable to me. My priority, though, if you're playing one lineup and want to go cheap and you need the salary savings, then I'm fine with Batum as the captain.
So again, back to the whole issue with Conley being out. We talked about kind of staying away from a couple of guys, Bogdanovich, Ingles from captain mode, but how often are you getting to these guys second to last guy on your roster, assuming that salary permits?
So let's see. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, for Ingles and Bogdanovich, and you're looking at 6,800, Ingles 6K. So outside of captain, which you pretty much told us to stay away from more often than not, I'm just curious how often you could get to one or both of these guys in fill spots kind of at the end of your lineup, salary permitting.
Yeah, it's Bogdanovich. I mean, there is a salary difference between them. Bogdanovich, $800 more expensive, but also I have Bogdanovich projected for about 3.5 more fantasy points. So he'd be the guy that I prefer there, and I have more exposure to him than Ingles, although both of them I think are good salary saving options.
Now, did you just wager $1 on Patrick Beverley's minutes tonight?
Yes. So we have 100 to 1 odds. I'm putting $1 because there's zero chance that Patrick Beverley plays 0 minutes. So, right now, Patrick Beverley, who has played 0 minutes in 2 of the last 4 games.
Right. Pretty good shot.
Yeah, so Patrick Beverley in the last 4 games, 50% of them, he's played 0 minutes. I now have a bet with Antoine Murphy where 100 to 1 odds he's giving me. I give him $1. If Patrick Beverley plays more than 0 minutes, he gives me $100. If Beverley plays no minutes today. And listen, I also said I think he's more likely to play than not. But given the fact that he's played 0 minutes in 2 of the last 4 games, yes, there's potentially doesn't step on the court.
You're not running him at all as a captain tonight, I imagine, huh? In any of your lineups?
No, but I have a small amount of exposure to him. We currently, by the way, here's the projections we have on Awesemo right now. We have Patrick Beverley projected to play 13 minutes and scored 9.8 fantasy points. For his salary, that doesn't make him unplayable. It doesn't make him all that desirable to me either. Like I said, Derek Favors currently we have projected to also play 13 minutes. But since he's a better fantasy producer than Patrick Beverley, we have Derek Favors projected for 12 fantasy points in 13 minutes.
As winding down, again, you can get us on the super chat as you see the premium Slack as well. So a question about Joe Ingles or Royce O'Neal from Greg SJ on the premium Slack, Greg.
Let me pull it up just so I could see all right. Ingles or O'Neal, that is pretty comfortably Ingles for me over O'Neal.
600 difference too. So I don't know, that may play into effect as well. How about 2 guys that, again, you differentiated as far as the tier is considered, with Rudy Gobert kind of being in that class from expectation, but from cost, at least, how often do you see yourself getting to 2 guys in Clarkson and Jackson tonight?
Clarkson is somebody who I don't have all that much interest in. So Clarkson, he's just so expensive, and the minutes, even with Mike Conley out, we're not seeing Jordan Clarkson play a whole ton of minutes. So the last 2 games, for Jordan Clarkson, 28 minutes and 27 minutes. Now, it's more than he normally plays when Conley's active, but it's also a amount of minutes that is going to be hard for me to expect all that much upside from him when he's 8,200 on DraftKings. There's an opportunity cost to playing him, right? If you roster him at that kind of salary, it probably means you're not able to get to Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Donovan Mitchell, one of those guys, and they're just much higher priority plays than Clarkson.
Terrence Mann, any interest in a punt option there? You can roster anybody and everybody you want with him as a captain, Greg. That's all.
I have Terrence Mann playing 0 minutes today.
Is there a 0% chance of that?
No, listen, the Clippers have changed the rotation so much in this series. Listen to Rajon. I mean, we talked about Rajon Rondo last game playing 0 minutes. The game before he played 0 minutes, Rondo played 28 minutes. There was a lot of variables involved in there also because, Reggie Jackson, like I said, got in early foul trouble. Rondo had to come in early. So Rondo went from playing 28 minutes to 0 minutes. There's a whole lot of variance with the end of this Clippers rotation. DeMarcus Cousins, a lot of people brought him up in the YouTube chat during the show. So Bogey in the playoffs, he was a DNP in every single game in the Dallas series. And then in the first 2 games against Utah, he played 4 minutes in the first game, and then he played 11 minutes in the last game because Zubac got into early foul trouble. Cousins is not guaranteed to play minutes, but that doesn't mean he's guaranteed to play, the same 11 minutes he played last game. Like there's an in between. There's a lot of wiggle room, but I also don't think any of these individual guys on the end of the Clippers bench are all that viable as plays anyway. There's a chance one of them goes out and scores 12, 13 fantasy points. But I think it's pretty unlikely we'd see any of these guys score 20 or 25 fantasy points.
Ryan Frey, man, you got to hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's going on here. And you could jump in right at the start of these shows. And then at 8:08, I think it was, you can squirm like Greg and everybody else, myself, who had Zubac and high exposure to him. And yes, now with 3 minutes to go, good luck. I mean, you thought you were squirming earlier. Poor Ryan has just popped in on the show and's like, hey, what's the latest with the Zubac guy? Bam, hit over the head with a sledgehammer. So yes, race and change and do everything you possibly can. Fade Zubac. I think that's been a big convo, at least as far as from the captain mode, if you are. Now, we only have a couple of more minutes here. So I wonder just on lineups where it's not a consistent or a bigger lineup where you're looking at maybe taking advantage of so many people owning Paul George. So you're moving away from him in one of your lineups. Can you get to, you mentioned Bogdanovich, can you get to him as a captain if Ingles and maybe Clarkson are out in that stance?
That's not a priority for me. I'd rather go either with one of the expensive guys, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, or I'd go really cheap with somebody like Nick Batum or Marcus Morris, who enables you to spend up for a bunch of stars. So to me, those mid-range guys, Joe Ingles, Bogdanovich, Jordan Clarkson, I don't think any of them are good captain plays.
And just as far as kind of winding down on FanDuel, I know Kawhi and George are getting a lot of exposure at that MVP spot, but I would think similarly to what we just talked about on the DraftKings side from a captain mode, if you were moving away from one of those two heavily owned guys at the top of that MVP spot, Batum and Morris, or maybe Morris and Batum start to become the next likely options outside of Mitchell. Sorry.
So for
MVP on
FanDuel, no, I would not play those guys at MVP on FanDuel at all. So because FanDuel, there's no salary difference wherever you play. There's no 1.5x salary. So you'd need them to be the highest scoring fantasy player in the game. And that is really, really unlikely to me.
Yeah, it's a major punt, right? I mean, it's like,
but it's not even a punt because there's no
shot of it happening.
But there's no gain benefit, right? Because on DraftKings, you play somebody really cheap in the captain spot, you're opening up additional salary where that doesn't happen on FanDuel.
All right, man. What the hell happened, by the way, as we wind down here? What happened that you saw that 5-second knockout? Can you paint that picture for everybody who missed it as they were locked into Spags?
So Terrence McKinney, who is who's going to be the highest score, and most likelihood the highest scoring player for the DFS slate today for MMA, making his UFC debut on 4 or 5 days notice, late second replacement. Fight starts, charges forward, basically knocks out Matt Frivola with a jab, 7 seconds. I think that's the second or third fastest knockout in UFC history. jumps on the octagon to celebrate, gets off, blows his knee out, and there we go. So that's a hell of a UFC debut. Takes it on short notice, 7-second knockout, blows his knee out. Yeah, that's a whole career in 7 seconds.
I'm getting it's either 4 seconds and it's a hard out, or it's the fourth fastest. That's what I figured from Tyler. It's very rare that I get like, hey, you guys got to get the hell out of here from Tyler. So that's why I figured it was the fourth fastest. Now, I immediately thought, I don't know why, but I immediately thought of like Grammatica, right? Where he kicks that game-winning kick, and doesn't he tear his ACL in the celebration? Martin Grammatica, remember the famous kicker injury after
I thought he broke his foot. I have to look.
Was it his foot?
Martin.
And then the other Grammatica bashed his head against the wall in celebration and hurt his neck. Like, it was a pretty bad neck injury.
Let's see. Martin Grammatica. Yeah, you're right. He tore his ACL.
But it was celebrating after that winning kick, right?
Oh no, that was Bill Grammatica, not Martin Grammatica.
Oh, okay.
Bill Grammatica tore his ACL.
God, there are a lot of Grammaticas. That's the third one. How were there 3? At least there are more Grammaticas than Gronks.
Hey, there's a lot of them out there.
Now, yeah, is this has to now take the cake, does it not? As we wind down here, as the most infamous injury post celebration that we've seen.
No, Kendrick Morales broke his leg celebrating a walk-off home run, and it altered his entire career. It to the point where he was heading into free agency the next year. He was one of the, not like a top tier hitter in baseball or anything, but Kendrick Morales was set to make a bunch of money in free agency and ended up signing for just a couple of $1 million. Like, it's something that cost him tens of millions of dollars and derailed his entire career.
Wow. So that's definitely number one.
Yes, for me. And I'm sure there's other ones, but at least ones that just pop into my mind as things that, really alter the course of somebody's career, that were also dumb injuries. That would be it.
T.O. Deck 20. Yeah. Jake Plummer also concussed himself against the wall, hitting his head. Who in their right mind thinks that's a good idea? Hopefully you got everything you needed from Greg Ehrenberg tonight. Make sure you follow him at G Ehrenberg DFS. I'm at Shander Show. Thanks to Tyler. Thank him. Thank us. Hit us up with a like. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and you want to be here bright and early tomorrow. Myself and Alex are going to be here for an NBA strategy show. Get you ready for another busy 2-game slate in this case. But for Greg, for Tyler, for Awesemo, for you out there spending some time with us, thank you, and have a great night.